Chapter 1. Jane stepped off the train in Fort Worth, scanning the busy streets for familiar faces. The Texas sun was relentless as she shielded her eyes with her hat. Her brown hair kept getting caught by the wind and blowing behind her. She knew she should have put her hair up instead of letting it flow. "Jane." Deborah called out and they embraced, months of separation dissolving in their reunion. "It's so good to see you." "Deborah, I've missed you all so much," Jane said. "Is it just you?" She looked around for more of her sisters, but there didn't appear to be any more waiting for her. "The others are waiting at Susan's house. She's Elizabeth Tandy's sister, and that's where you'll stay until you find a husband. There are so many unattached cowboys around here." "It won't take you long to find someone to love," Deborah said, guiding her sister toward the waiting carriage and setting off for Susan's house. It was a 30-minute drive out of Fort Worth to Susan's house, and the sisters talked non-stop along the way. Finally, the house came into view. "Welcome home, Jane," Amy said, embracing her youngest sister. "We wanted to all wait for you at the train station, but there are just too many of us, so we've gathered here to welcome you home." Imogene hurried toward Jane, and Jane smiled happily. "It's so good to see you." "You too. You need to meet Susan and she'll show you your room, but all of us are here and ready to catch up when you are." The next few hours passed too quickly for Jane, who watched her sisters leave one by one as they had to cook for their new husbands. She'd had to stay behind and not attend the matchmaking dance a few months before because she was considered too young to marry until she was 18. Of course, that was Mrs. Jackson's rule. Women married much younger as a rule, but their matron was always worried about her girls. The next evening, Faith and her husband Kane held a party in Jane's honor. Lanterns cast a warm glow over friends who welcomed Jane into their community. Kane introduced Jane around. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present my sister-in-law, Jane Brown." Guests tipped their hats and expressed their delight at having her join their community. Amidst the festivity, Brenda led Jane toward a man whose laughter rose above the din. "Jane, meet Anthony Fennell. He's our telegraph operator," she said, introducing her to a young man with an infectious grin and eyes that sparkled with mischief. "Anthony, this is my sister Jane, just arrived from the orphanage." "Ah, Miss Brown, welcome," Anthony exclaimed. "Fort Worth is a better place for your presence. Tonight, I am at your service." Jane offered a tentative smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Fennell." "Please, call me Anthony," he chuckled. "Telegraphy is full of dots and dashes, much like life, don't you think?" No?" Jane had no idea what the man was talking about, but she was willing to listen. Anthony laughed good-naturedly at Jane's confusion. "Forgive me, Miss Brown. I have a tendency to speak in metaphors. What I mean is, life is full of ups and downs, much like the dots and dashes of Morse code." Jane nodded, beginning to understand. "I suppose that's true. And please, call me Jane." "Very well, Jane," Anthony said with a smile. "Tell me, how are you finding Fort Worth so far?" "It's quite different from Massachusetts," Jane admitted. "But everyone has been so welcoming. I'm excited to start this new chapter of my life." "And we're excited to have you," Anthony said sincerely. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help a lady in need." Jane blushed slightly at his chivalrous offer. "Thank you." As the party continued, Jane found herself drawn into conversation with Anthony. His easy manner and quick wit put her at ease, and she found herself laughing more than she had in a long time. "So, Jane," Anthony said, his eyes twinkling, "what do you think of Texas so far? Is it everything you dreamed it would be?" Jane considered the question for a moment. "It's certainly different," she said thoughtfully. "But in a good way. I feel like I can breathe here, like there's room to grow and explore." Anthony nodded. "That's the beauty of this place. It's wild and untamed, but also full of possibility. You never know what each day will bring." As they talked, Jane couldn't help but notice the way Anthony's gaze lingered on her, the way his smile seemed to light up his whole face. She felt a flutter of something in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the balmy Texas evening. The evening wore on, banjos played and glasses clinked. For the first time in her memory, Jane felt truly cherished. Her laughter mingled with the music of the party. "Isn't this something?" she said to Anthony. "Your sisters really love you," he said with a wink. "'Tis not every day we get to celebrate someone like you." Feeling gratitude flood her heart, Jane replied, "I never imagined such a welcome." Jane couldn't take her eyes off a man across the room. "Life is full of surprises," he said, "especially in Texas." Brenda noticed her sister Jane's glances toward Jack Stewart and seized the opportunity. Approaching Jack, she said, "I do believe you haven't met my sister, Jane." Jack's gaze found Jane as he nodded politely. "Would you care to join us for some lemonade on the porch?" Brenda offered. Of course, Jack agreed. Jack was tall with dark hair and eyes that Jane wanted to lose herself in. On the porch, Brenda handed them each a glass of lemonade before excusing herself. Jane, feeling anxious, met Jack's friendly gaze. "By the way you're dressed, I guess you're a cowboy," Jane said with curiosity. "Sure am. I work for Seth Clinkingbeard, Brenda's husband." "You grow up on a ranch, and horses become your companions," Jack responded. "How about yourself?" "I've always admired them," Jane admitted. "They're such noble creatures." As they spoke, their conversation flowed through tales of childhood adventures and dreams under expansive skies. "Sounds like you were quite the explorer," Jack chuckled after one of Jane's stories. "Or a tomboy," Jane laughed. "You look for your own little piece of freedom wherever you can find it." "Freedom," Jack mused, "out here, there's room for everyone." Their laughter intertwined with distant fiddle music. As laughter settled, the porch swing creaked and Anthony Fennell appeared. His blonde hair shimmered in the lantern light while he grinned. "Mind if I join?" he asked, tipping an imaginary hat. "Not at all," Jane replied. "We could use a diversion." "I've always believed life's too short for anything but laughter and good company," Anthony said, leaning against the railing. Speaking of tales, Jack interjected. "Jane, have you heard much about Fort Worth?" "Only what I've read and what Mrs. Jackson would say," Jane admitted. "You're in for a treat," Jack promised, his eyes lit up. He shared stories of cattle drives, cowboys, railroad tracks, and Hell's Half-Acre's rough reputation. "Every brick has seen history play out," Jack said reverently. "And there's the Trinity River, threading through town like a witness to change." "You hold a great deal of pride for your home," Jane said. Jack smiled warmly. "Of course, I do. Perhaps I could show you around one day." "Nothing would please me more," Jane responded, excitement blossoming within her. There was something about Jack that made her heart beat faster. She only wished he had a future as more than a cowboy for her brother-in-law. Anthony, sensing their connection, winked and excused himself. "I'll leave you two to the stars and each other's company." "Thank you, Anthony," Jane laughed, grateful as he departed lightheartedly. "Good night, folks," Anthony called, disappearing into the lively house. In the quiet, Jane was wrapped in a Texas night, her spirit lifted by tales of Fort Worth and the company of a man becoming more than an acquaintance. As the party wound down, Jack turned to Jane, anticipation in his eyes. "Miss Brown, I reckon tomorrow's service won't be quite complete without a proper tour of Fort Worth afterward. Might I have the honor of accompanying you on a carriage ride through town?" Jane's heart danced at the invitation. "Mr. Stewart, that would be a delight," she replied, her cheeks flushing with warmth. "Excellent," Jack said, his smile wide. "I'll meet you after church then." The following morning, church bells rang clear. Jane entered the sanctuary, her mind abuzz with the prospect of the afternoon's adventure. As she slid into a seat near the front, Jack took the place beside her. "Morning, Miss Brown," he whispered. "Good morning, Mr. Stewart," Jane returned, excitement evident in her voice. Throughout the sermon on love and devotion, Jack's hand brushed against Jane's, sparking a strong connection between them. Each hymn seemed a duet as prayers expressed shared hope for their future. After the final amen, Jack's gaze held an unspoken promise. "Shall we?" He offered his arm. "Absolutely," Jane agreed, stepping out into the bright light of a new day, her spirit buoyant with possibility. Jack strode down Fort Worth's dusty Main Street. Jane looked all around her from her place at his side, her senses captivated by hoofbeats and smoked meat's aroma. The Gilded Steer, Jack gestured to a swinging door restaurant, best brisket in town. Inside, they settled into a wooden booth amid the player piano tunes and cheerful patrons. Jack recommended the chili with a wicked grin. Jane hesitated for a moment before conceding. Over lunch, she savored each bite while listening to Jack's tales of the vibrant local characters. Exiting into a lazy hot afternoon, they climbed aboard a waiting carriage pulled by a glossy chestnut horse. Jack pointed out landmarks as the streets of Fort Worth rolled past, bustling stockyard pens and future church construction on a distant hill. Jane was entirely enthralled by this new world so far from her birthplace, laughing at Jack's anecdotes about Longhorn escapades. He met her gaze with fondness. "Seems you've taken to our little corner of Texas quite well." "I never expected such charm," Jane admitted, heart dancing between excitement and uncertainty. "Give it time," Jack promised softly, eyes more lonely than the moon. "Texas has a way of surprising you." Their eyes met, the carriage gliding through Fort Worth and across a threshold of possibility. Jane's heart swelled with the day's events and the unfolding romance reminiscent of wild prairie rose petals. "Tell me more," she urged, leaning closer, eager to continue their dance of discovery. With a smile, Jack obliged, weaving stories and dreams into the golden afternoon. Jane stepped out of the carriage, and as Jack urged the horses onward, he tipped his hat with a grin. "Good night, Miss Jane." "Good night, Jack," she whispered after him. Up the pathway to Susan and David's house, the porch creaked in welcome. Inside, silence enveloped her. In her room, Jane removed her hat and gazed into the mirror. A glimmer of the unknown sparkled within her eyes. Seated on her bed, she reflected on her past, the orphanage, Mrs. Jackson's guidance, and now Jack Stewart, a symbol of Texas itself. She recalled the scriptures about love's patience and kindness, contemplating whether there was room for their hands intertwined. "Lord," she whispered, "guide my heart." Nightfall cradled her as she nestled into the quilts. Her mind danced with memories of Jack, his dark eyes crinkling when he smiled and his laughter resonating deep within her. The promise of tomorrow filled her with eagerness. "Fort Worth," she breathed, tasting adventure. "What wonders you have yet to show me." In her dreams, Jane rode alongside Jack. Dreamland embraced certainty and shimmered with new beginnings. Chapter 2. Susan drove Jane to town on Monday morning. There was no real reason for Jane to be in Fort Worth except she wanted to learn about the area. The town buzzed with activity as merchants opened their stalls and children hurried past. She breathed in the scents of fresh hay and roasting coffee beans, soaking in the energy of her new home. With purposeful strides towards the Grand Hotel, Jane spotted Gail leaning against the wooden doorway frame. "Jane!" Gail called out. "Good morning, Gail," Jane said with a jesting tone. "I thought I might enjoy a meal here if you don't mind." Gail chuckled and ushered her inside. "Come, fill your belly and warm your bones. The chef is experimenting with stew recipes today." As they shared an amused glance, Jane followed Gail into the hotel's dining room filled with clinking silverware and murmurs of conversation. Gail gestured to a table and said, "Make yourself comfortable, today you'll dine like royalty, or at least someone who didn't have to cook." Gratefully settling into her seat, Jane observed the cheerful bustle of patrons while she awaited her meal, eager to embrace every wonder of this new world. "First time in town?" The waitress's voice interrupted Jane's thoughts, as warm as the coffee she poured. "Yes," Jane replied, observing the woman's crisply ironed apron. "It's all quite new to me. I'm Gail's sister." "This town's full of stories," the waitress said. "Old man Henley claims he saw a ghost mourning his lost elf princess by the creek." "Truly?" Jane asked, intrigued. "Truly," the waitress affirmed with a wink. "And Miss Loretta at the corner table, some say she descends from the French royal family themselves, having otherworldly grace." As tales unfolded like vibrant patchwork quilts, Jane marveled at the interconnected lives in this small corner of the world. Her meal arrived steaming and savory. The chef at the hotel was excellent at creating new recipes. While enjoying her stew, Jane noticed a flyer announcing an upcoming dance. "That sounds exciting," Jane said. "The whole town will attend," the waitress remarked. "If you're aiming to meet folks, that's the place to be." "Thank you," Jane said gratefully. "I believe I shall attend." "It sounds delightful. Just mind you don't get swept off your feet by some smooth-talking cowboy," the waitress warned with a smile. Jane tucked away the thought like a cherished keepsake, content to explore the town's history and anticipate dances yet to come. Jane Brown entered the bustling market, immediately drawn to the vibrant stalls. Sunlight cast a warm glow on the goods as she moved from one display to another. "Miss, do try a sample," called a baker, offering her a cinnamon bun. Jane obliged, delighting in the sweetness, and thanked him earnestly. Continuing on, she admired a stall of intricately crafted quilts. The vendor, Martha, introduced herself and welcomed Jane to their community. She mentioned a barn raising next Saturday and invited Jane to join. Intrigued by the opportunity to participate in a barn raising, Jane eagerly accepted the invitation. Martha assured her that she would fit in just fine before attending to another customer. As Jane made her way through the market, a striking saddle in a leatherworker's stall caught her eye. The intricate tooling depicted a horse and rider galloping across a landscape. She couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. "Finest saddle in 3 counties, the leatherworker said, noticing her interest. "Made it myself." "You ride, miss?" Jane shook her head. "I'm afraid not, but it's beautiful work." "Well, stick around these parts long enough and you'll find yourself in a saddle soon enough. Riding's in our blood out here." Jane smiled at the thought. Perhaps this new life would bring all sorts of firsts. As she thanked the leatherworker and moved on, she spotted a familiar figure across the way, Jack Stewart, loading supplies into his wagon. He caught her eye and tipped his hat in greeting, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Jane. Fancy meeting you here." Jane felt a flutter in her chest at his friendly demeanor. "Mr. Stewart, good day to you. I trust your errands are going well?" "They are," Jack replied, securing a sack of feed. "And please, call me Jack. Mr. Stewart makes me feel like my father." Jane chuckled. "Very well, Jack. I shall remember that." "I heard tell of a barn raising next Saturday," he said casually. "Will I have the pleasure of seeing you there?" "As a matter of fact, you will," Jane confirmed, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "It'll be my first barn raising." "Wonderful," Jack said, his eyes twinkling with approval. "I'll be sure to save a dance for you then." Jane felt a blush creep into her cheeks at his forwardness. "I shall look forward to it," she managed, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. With a tip of his hat and a parting smile, Jack climbed into his wagon and set off, leaving Jane with a whirlwind of emotions. The idea of dancing with him sent a thrill through her, but also a twinge of nervousness. She had little experience with such social gatherings. As if sensing her thoughts, Gail appeared at her side. "I see you've found Jack," she said with a knowing smile. Jane nodded. "I wasn't even looking for him, and there he was." "Well, I'm glad you saw a friendly face." "I need to get back to my garden, but I had to have one of the baker's cinnamon rolls first," Gail said. "Enjoy your garden," Jane responded. Jane left the market, her spirits lifted by the townsfolk's kindness and the anticipation of upcoming festivities. As she walked, thoughts of the dance and barn raising intertwined with a growing sense of belonging in this quaint corner of Texas. Each encounter threaded her deeper into the community's tapestry. Jane walked through the stockyards, surrounded by the scent of livestock and leather. The air was punctuated by sawdust and noise from cattle and men at work. A bright sign caught her eye, "Rodeo, coming September 3rd." Intrigued by stories she'd heard about these events, Jane wondered if Jack would be interested in joining her. "Quite the sight, ain't it?" Anthony Fennell's voice came from behind her. Jane turned to see him grinning, leaning on a fence. His hair gleamed under the sun as his eyes held laughter. "I've never witnessed a rodeo before," she admitted. "You're in for a treat," he replied. "The whole town turns out for it." Half-jokingly, Jane asked who would be brave enough to escort her there. Speaking of escorts, Anthony said playfully, the dance next Friday evening, would you join me? Surprised and flattered, Jane nodded. Mr. Fennel, it would be my pleasure. Call me Anthony. He winked. And I shall count the days until then. Thank you, Anthony. Jane felt more connected with every encounter. Anthony tipped his hat and left, leaving Jane excited for the dance and intrigued by him. Jane explored the bustling stalls, captivated by the local vendors' offerings. She found herself drawn to a dignified horse-drawn carriage. Miss Brown, may I offer you a ride? Jack Stewart's dark eyes gleamed with amusement as he invited her. Surprised, Jane hesitated before agreeing and excused herself to inform Gail of her change in plans. She wouldn't need that ride home after all. Moments later, she sat beside Jack, the steady rhythm of hooves and creaking leather filling their silence. As they traveled, Jack pointed out landmarks like St. Andrew's Church and the modest library. His stories of Fort Worth painted a vivid picture of the town's past while inviting her to contribute her own tale. With each passing moment, Jane felt an increasing sense of belonging, encouraged not only by Jack's lively anecdotes, but also his genuine interest in her story. I suppose I'm still finding my story, she confessed, her voice a mix of vulnerability and wonder, but I am grateful for guides like you. Guides, eh? Jack chuckled. Consider me at your service, Miss Brown. As they continued toward Susan and David's ranch, the tapestry of Fort Worth grew richer with every shared experience. At the Daly's house, Jane watched Jack secure the horses before joining her by the fence. Jane, he called out, are you ready for that picnic by the Trinity? I am, she replied, excitement in her eyes. They arrived at a picturesque clearing by the Trinity River and unpacked their homemade treats onto a spread-out blanket. Your hands have wrought a feast fit for royalty, Jack said, eyeing the meal appreciatively. They exchanged stories over sandwiches and pie, Jane's orphanage tales forming a patchwork quilt of memories, and Jack's ranch life painting images of open spaces and freedom. Their laughter flowed like the nearby water as they shared their lives with each other. Tell me, Jane, Jack asked, his tone growing serious, do you ever think about what Providence has in store for you here? I believe we're placed where we're meant to be, Jane said thoughtfully, and perhaps love for others is our truest compass. Jane found herself captivated by the tranquility of the moment and the warmth of Jack's presence. His words echoed in her mind, prompting her to reflect on the path that had led her to this very spot. I must admit, Jane said softly, I never imagined my life would take such a turn. But being here, in Fort Worth, surrounded by the kindness of strangers, it feels like a blessing, a chance to start anew. Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. Sometimes, the most unexpected journeys lead us to exactly where we're meant to be, and the people we meet along the way? He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a gentle sincerity. They become friends that weave our stories together. Jane felt a flutter in her heart at his words. I couldn't agree more, she said, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. And I am grateful that friends have brought us together, Jack. They packed up their picnic and made their way back to the carriage. The journey home was filled with a comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional remark about the beauty of the landscape or the anticipation of upcoming events. Upon arriving at the Daly's ranch, Jack helped Jane down from the carriage, his hand lingering in hers for a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for a wonderful afternoon, Jane, he said, his voice warm with sincerity. The pleasure was all mine, Jane replied, feeling a blush creep into her cheeks. She watched as Jack tended to the horses, admiring the gentle way he handled them. As they walked toward the house, Jane couldn't help but marvel at the turn her life had taken. Just weeks ago, she had been an orphaned foundling, uncertain of her place in the world. Now, she found herself surrounded by the warmth of a new family and the promise of a bright future. Susan greeted them at the door, a knowing smile on her face as she took in their flushed cheeks and bright eyes. I trust you had a pleasant outing, she asked, ushering them inside. It was lovely, Jane said, her voice filled with genuine joy. The Trinity River is a sight to behold. It is, Susan agreed. And I'm glad to see you making friends, Jane. I'm glad to be called Jane's friend, Jack said, grinning at Jane. Hopefully someday, I'll be called more than a friend. The following evening, Jane strode along the dirt path, lanterns casting a warm glow on the lively town fair. The air hummed with laughter and chatter as Fort Worth celebrated the summer's end. "Jane," Anthony Fennell called out, navigating through the crowd. "Care for a try at the ring toss?" His eyes sparkled with mischief. "Thank you, Mr. Fennell," Jane replied, amusement in her voice. "But my aim is quite uncertain." Joined by Sam, Henry, and Lucas, men she'd met at church on Sunday, they shared laughs by the game booths. However, Jane's thoughts wandered to Jack Stewart. When he approached, his dark eyes filled with joy, the fair seemed even brighter. "Have you seen the quilts on display?" Jack asked. "I haven't yet," Jane admitted, "but I would love to. My sister Faith is the quilter in the family. She does amazing work, and I love to look at the finished products." Pausing near the edge of the festivities, Jack's tone turned gentle and serious. "Jane, there's a dance next Saturday at the Grange Hall. Might I have the honor of your company?" Jane felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Mr. Stewart, I'd be delighted to accompany you to the dance," she said, her voice both excited and graceful. Friday, she would accompany Anthony, and Saturday would be spent with Jack. She was shocked at how quickly her social calendar was filling. "Then it's settled," Jack replied, anticipation in his voice. "I reckon it'll be an evening to remember." Chapter 3. Jane descended the stairs of the Daly homestead. Her heart fluttered, eager for Susan Daly's wisdom on matters of the heart. Susan stood in the parlor, as if expecting her. "Come in, dear," Susan said warmly. "You said there's something you need to talk about?" "Please, take a seat," Susan gestured to a cushioned rocking chair near the hearth. As Jane settled in, Susan sat across from her, eyes reflecting the dancing flames and years of experience. "Courting is quite the endeavor, isn't it?" Susan began. Jane nodded nervously. "Oh, it is. I find myself adrift in it all. I've never been courted before, and there are at least 5 men who are showing me special attention." "Don't worry," Susan replied with humor. "You've come to the right place. I've had my share of learning when it comes to matters of the heart." Susan leaned forward, shadows dancing on her face. "My journey to matrimony was a bumpy carriage ride. I answered an ad for a mail-order bride and set out with dreams of love." Jane's eyes widened, heart racing at the thought. But instead, Susan continued, "I found my betrothed had died, leaving his brother David, a widower with 4 boys, hoping I would agree to be their mother." Jane gasped. "You never wanted other children?" "It's not that. My younger siblings were wild. Not Elizabeth, of course, but the others. I was the oldest, and my younger brothers and sisters were dubbed the Demon Horde by the townsfolk. Elizabeth and I saved up and bought purple paint for our room, and while I was at work the following day, our brother and sister, twins who didn't have the sense God gave a turnip, painted the cow purple. They made sure to put down newspaper to not stain the barn floor, though. It made no sense to me. I decided I didn't want to have to parent another woman's children, like I'd had to do so often with my brothers and sisters. I don't think I would want to parent someone else's children either." "Then you need to be careful not to let a widower court you," Susan said, eyes warm but wise. "Life is unpredictable, listen to your heart when choosing a partner. Be true to yourself. Don't settle. Marriage is long. Choose someone who makes you feel good about yourself." Jane absorbed each word, feeling empowered and realizing that choosing a suitor was up to her. "It's about honoring your heart, even in the face of expectations," Susan said, her gaze steady. "This is your life and happiness at stake. Never marry a man that you don't love." Jane shifted in her seat, clasping her hands together. The scent of freshly baked bread comforted her. But how does one balance personal desires with practicalities? Like housing. "Are you worried we'll make you leave?" "Yes," Jane admitted, her expression clouding. "I'm unsure how swiftly I need a suitor to provide a new home." "There is no deadline for finding a match," Susan reassured her. Jane clasped the teacup, seeking confirmation in Susan's steady gaze as afternoon light warmed the parlor. Uncertainty creeps upon me, Jane confessed. Setting down her cup, Susan reassured, your instincts are the compass given by Providence. Trust them as you would the northern star. She leaned back, eyes reflecting years of wisdom. Follow your heart, Jane. Jane ascended the creaking stairs, Susan's advice strengthening her resolve. Her modest room was a sanctuary for reflection and growth. Sitting at the small desk under the window, she wrote what had touched her the most as she'd spoken with Susan. Be true, she wrote, to thine own heart. As the dance approached, anticipation mingled with unease. Anthony Fennell would escort her, his easygoing nature promising an enjoyable night. He arrived at dusk with a grin that never seemed to leave his face. Evening, Jane, he greeted playfully. Ready for some dancing? Always. Jane replied with a smile. At the social hall, lively tunes filled the air as they joined the townsfolk in a whirl of colors and laughter. Jane and Anthony moved gracefully through the dances, his eyes filled with merriment. As they danced, Jane realized she'd never seen the man frown, or even have a straight face. He was always laughing and making her laugh. Never pegged you for a wallflower, Anthony teased as they spun around. Nor did I imagine a telegraph operator to be such a nimble dancer, she retorted light-heartedly. The evening wore on with conversations and jokes shared between them. However, as the music faded, Jane felt a pang of disappointment. Their connection lacked romantic affection. Skirts swirling, Jane joined Lucas Montgomery on the dance floor as the lively tune filled the hall. His gaze, both contemplative and sincere, held her attention. I feel like this is a perfect night for dancing, Lucas remarked. If only I was lighter on my feet, Jane replied. I've never danced with a woman who could follow my lead so well, he countered. This dance has been particularly enjoyable. Jane couldn't help but smile at Lucas's compliment. His thoughtful nature and genuine interest in their conversations made her feel at ease. As they moved together, the rest of the hall seemed to fade away. You know, I've always found dancing to be a metaphor for life, Lucas mused as they twirled. Two people, moving in harmony, navigating the ups and downs of the music. I never thought of it that way, Jane replied, intrigued by his perspective, but I suppose you're right. It's about finding a partner who complements your own steps. Lucas nodded, his eyes holding a depth that drew her in. Exactly. And sometimes, the most unexpected partnerships can create the most beautiful dance. As the song ended, Jane found herself reluctant to let go of his hand. There was something about Lucas that truly intrigued her, but she knew there was another waiting for his turn with her. Next, Samuel Parker led her through a dance. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room before focusing on her. Evenings like these remind me why we toil under the Texas sun, Samuel observed. Without the toil, we wouldn't appreciate the respite, she ventured. It's the contrast that makes life sweet, he agreed. As they moved across the dance floor, Jane found herself drawn to Samuel's pragmatic outlook. His words resonated with her own experiences. I suppose it's all about finding balance, Jane mused. Between the challenges and the joys, the work and the leisure. Samuel nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. And perhaps, finding someone to share that balance with. His words hung in the air between them, a subtle invitation that made Jane's heart skip a beat. As the music swelled, she allowed herself to be swept up in the moment, savoring the feeling of Samuel's strong arms guiding her through the steps. When the dance ended, Jane found herself breathless, not just from the exertion, but from the emotion stirring within her. Thank you so much for the dance. I enjoyed our conversation, she said. Finally, Henry Caldwell invited her for a dance. His sandy hair tousled and laughter infectious, he joked, careful now, Jane, I might step on your toes. I'll rely on your reputed charm for protection, she said. Each man brought a different energy to the dance, captivating Jane's thoughts. Yet her mind wandered to Jack, full of life with dark eyes hinting at something profound. As the evening waned, Anthony took her home in his buggy. As they drove, they told each other stories. The simple act of riding in a buggy feels like a grand adventure, Jane said, laughter lingering. When you're raised in an orphanage, you're thankful for wagon rides with all the boys and girls in the back of the wagon. With the right company, even mundane journeys are delights, Anthony responded. Thank you, Jane expressed as they arrived at Susan and David's house. Tonight was wonderful. Anytime, he said, tipping his hat as his eyes crinkled with a smile. I hope you'll allow me to escort you again soon. I would like that, she said, though her feelings were mixed. She'd enjoyed the evening, but she hadn't felt anything special for him other than as a friend. Jane stepped down from the buggy and felt a breeze brush against her cheek. In the quiet moments that followed, she reflected on her recent partners, Lucas's insight, Samuel's strength, Henry's humor, and Jack's mysterious intentions. She trusted her heart to guide her in recognizing the one who was meant to be her husband. Chapter 4. Jane walked to Seth and Brenda's house on Monday afternoon. Jack had invited her to learn about ranching, and she found she would accept any invitation that would allow her to spend time with him. Welcome to our humble spread, came a warm voice. Jane turned to find Jack greeting her with an open smile. I'm excited to show you around. I've worked here for 5 years and know the ranch inside and out. I can't wait to learn about ranching. Does Seth mind that I'm here? Jack shook his head. Not at all. Seth is the nicest boss who has ever lived. He nodded toward the corral. Let's see the horses first. All of our horses come from either David Daly's ranch or Adam Kelso's ranch. They're the best horse trainers in this entire area. As they walked toward the corral, Jane smiled. They're so majestic. Jack grinned at her enthusiasm. That they are. And each one has its own personality. Take Biscuit here, he said, gesturing to a handsome chestnut gelding. He's as gentle as a lamb, perfect for a novice rider. But Pepper, he pointed to a spirited black mare, she's got a mind of her own, takes a firm hand to handle her. Jane watched in awe as the horses trotted around the corral, their manes flowing in the warm Texas breeze. I've always wanted to learn to ride a horse. Jack's eyes lit up at her words. Well, there's no time like the present. How about a riding lesson right now? Seth has given me the entire afternoon to just show you around. It would help you understand the ranch if you could ride. Jane's heart skipped a beat at the prospect. Really? You'd teach me? Of course, it would be my pleasure. He led her over to Biscuit and showed her how to approach the horse calmly. Always let him see you coming, and speak softly so you don't startle him. Jane followed his instructions, gently stroking Biscuit's nose when she reached him. The horse nuzzled her hand, eliciting a delighted laugh from Jane. He likes you, Jack observed with a smile. That's a good sign. Under Jack's patient guidance, Jane learned how to saddle Biscuit and mount him properly. As she settled into the saddle, a thrill of excitement raced through her. Jack led Biscuit by the reins into the open pasture, Jane perched atop the gentle gelding. Hold the reins like this, he instructed, demonstrating with his hands. And sit up straight, keeping your heels down. Jane adjusted her grip and posture, determined to learn properly. As they began a slow walk around the pasture, she marveled at the sensation of the horse's smooth gait beneath her. You're a natural, Jack praised, walking alongside her. See how Biscuit responds to your cues? Jane's heart swelled with pride as she gazed upon the majestic animal before her. She felt a deepening bond between them, a connection that seemed to transcend words. They spent the next hour leisurely exploring the vast pasture, Jack acting as their guide and pointing out various features of the ranch with an air of familiarity. His stories were like photographs, capturing moments in time and bringing them to life with vivid details and colorful anecdotes. Jane listened intently, hanging on every word as they rode through the rolling hills and lush greenery of the ranch. It was as if they were creating their own little world within this peaceful sanctuary, sharing this special moment together. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting a golden glow across the pasture, Jack turned to Jane with a warm smile. We should probably head back now. I don't want to keep you out too late. Jane felt a pang of disappointment at the thought of their time together coming to an end. She had been so enthralled by the beauty of the ranch and Jack's company that she had lost track of time. I suppose you're right, she agreed reluctantly. I'm having supper with Brenda and Seth. Brenda said I could invite someone if you'd like to eat with us. Jack smiled. I wasn't ready for our time to end, so that's perfect. Let me show you how to unsaddle and wipe down Biscuit, and then we'll go to the house. Jane listened attentively as Jack demonstrated the proper way to unsaddle Biscuit and groom him after their ride. His hands moved with practiced ease, and she could see the deep affection he held for the horse in his gentle touches and soothing words. There we go, old boy, Jack murmured, giving Biscuit a final pat, all set for a good rest. He turned to Jane with a warm smile. Ready to head in? I'm sure Brenda has something delicious planned for supper. Jane nodded eagerly, her stomach rumbling at the thought of a hearty meal after their invigorating ride. As they made their way towards the house, she couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt to walk beside Jack, as if they had known each other for years rather than mere days. Brenda greeted them at the door with a beaming smile, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting out from the kitchen behind her. Jane, Jack, come on in, supper's almost ready. As they stepped into the cozy farmhouse, Jane was struck by the warmth and love that seemed to radiate from every corner. Family photographs adorned the walls, and a well-worn Bible rested on the coffee table, a testament to the faith that anchored this household. Seth emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Jack, good to see you, he greeted with a firm handshake. I hope Jane here hasn't been too much trouble, he added with a wink. Jack chuckled. On the contrary, she's a natural with the horses. Took to riding like a duck to water. Jane felt a blush creep into her cheeks at Jack's praise. I had an excellent teacher, she demurred, casting him a grateful smile. As they settled around the dining table, Seth said a heartfelt grace, thanking the Lord for the bountiful meal and the company of good friends. Jane found herself nodding along, a sense of peace and belonging washing over her. The conversation flowed easily as they enjoyed the savory stew and fresh bread. Seth regaled them with tales of growing up on the ranch, his eyes twinkling with mirth as he recounted the mishaps and triumphs. Jack chimed in with his own stories, painting a vivid picture of life on the sprawling Texas range. Jane listened intently, soaking up every detail. She marveled at the sense of camaraderie and shared purpose that bound these people together. It was a far cry from the life she had known at the orphanage. As she glanced around the table, taking in the smiling faces of her new friends, Jane felt a swell of gratitude in her heart. After the meal, Brenda shooed them out of the kitchen, insisting on handling the cleanup herself. You two go on and enjoy the evening, she urged with a knowing smile. The dishes will keep. Jack and Jane found themselves wandering out onto the porch, the night air a welcome respite from the heat of the day. It was still hot, but at least the sun wasn't shining down on them any longer. The stars twinkled overhead, a vast canopy stretching out across the inky sky. It's so beautiful out here, Jane breathed, leaning against the railing. I don't think I've ever seen so many stars. Jack moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. Jane felt a tingle of electricity at Jack's touch, her heart quickening in her chest. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Penny for your thoughts, she ventured softly, a gentle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Jack turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. I was just thinking about how much I've enjoyed spending time with you today, Jane. Showing you the ranch, teaching you to ride. It's been a real pleasure. Jane felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words. I've enjoyed it too, Jack, more than I can say. You've made me feel so welcome here. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and reassuring, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own. You do belong here, Jane. I knew it from the moment I met you. Jane's breath caught in her throat at the sincerity in his voice. She searched his face, finding only honesty and a hint of something more, something that set her heart racing. Jack, He lifted his free hand, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. I know we haven't known each other long, but there's something special about you, Jane. Something that makes me want to be around you, to learn everything about you. Jane leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment. When she opened them again, she found Jack gazing at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I feel the same way," she whispered. He stood for a moment, and his face seemed to be filled with an emotion she didn't quite understand. "May I walk you home?" he asked. "I'd like that," Jane replied. "I'm just going to say goodnight to Brenda first." Jane stepped back into the house, her heart still fluttering from the moment she had shared with Jack on the porch. She found Brenda in the kitchen, humming as she finished wiping down the counters. "Brenda, thank you so much for the lovely meal," Jane said warmly. "I can't remember the last time I felt so at home." Brenda turned to face her, a knowing twinkle in her eye. "You're going to grow to love Texas as much as the rest of us do." Jane nodded, a lump forming in her throat at the older woman's kindness. "Jack has offered to walk me home. I just wanted to say goodnight and thank you again." Brenda gave her a quick hug, the scent of fresh bread enveloping Jane. "You're welcome here anytime," Brenda said, giving Jane a gentle squeeze. "Now, you best not keep Jack waiting." She winked conspiratorially, causing Jane to blush. With a final goodnight, Jane stepped back out onto the porch where Jack was waiting. He offered her his arm, and together they set off down the path toward the Daly's ranch. As they walked, Jack regaled her with more stories of life on the ranch, his deep voice washing over her like a soothing balm. She found herself laughing at his tales of mischievous calves and ornery horses, marveling at the depth of his knowledge. All too soon, they arrived at the door of the Daly's home. Jane turned to face Jack, a shy smile playing at her lips. "Thank you for walking me home," she murmured. Jack took her hand in his thumb gently caressing her knuckles. "It was my pleasure, Jane. I hope you know how much I've come to care for you, even in this short time." Jane stared at him for a moment, smiling. "I care about you too." But would she be able to be married to a man who didn't have a place of his own? Who was working as a cowboy? She didn't know. She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for today," she said softly before going inside the house. Oh, how Jack made her heart flutter. Chapter 5. Under the relentless Texas sun, Jane and Jack walked through the paddocks of Susan and David's ranch. Laughter bubbled between them like a spring creek after a heavy rain, while the horses nosed at their pockets, seeking treats or affection with equal fervor. "Careful there," Jack chuckled, brushing down a chestnut mare's silken mane. "Daisy's got a fondness for ribbons. Wouldn't want her mistaking that pretty thing in your hair for a snack." Jane's hand flew to the ribbon, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you for the warning," she replied. "It would be quite the sight, me chasing Daisy around the ranch for a scrap of fabric." "Ah, but what a delightful chase it would be," Jack said, his dark eyes gleaming with unspoken jokes. They moved from one horse to another, an easy camaraderie settling over them as they shared tales from their contrasting worlds, her life at the orphanage with its communal harmony, and his days on the ranch filled with earthy toils and simple pleasures. With each shared story, the gap between their experiences narrowed until it seemed they had always known one another. Jack reached into his pocket and produced a small box wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. The neat fold spoke of careful attention, and the twinkle in his eye revealed a secret delight. "Here now, Jane," he said, extending the gift toward her. "This is for you." "Jack, what is this?" Jane asked, her voice a mix of surprise and curiosity, taking the package with hands that belied a tremble. "Open it and see," he urged, the corners of his mouth turning up in anticipation. Her fingers worked the twine, unraveling the knot with care not to tear the paper. Their breaths seemed to mingle and hold in the air, the moment stretching out like the endless Texas plains surrounding them. She peeled back the layers, revealing the thoughtful token within, and the world seemed to pause, waiting for her reaction. "Jack, Jane began, words failing her as she took in the contents of the package. His laughter was gentle, the sound carrying across the fields as if inviting the very land to share in their joy. "Thought you might like it," he said simply, yet the depth of his gaze suggested a wealth of meaning behind the gesture. "Like it? It's wonderful," Jane stammered, warmth flooding her face and heart alike, a sense of belonging enveloping her as thoroughly as the Texas heat. Every lady needs a companion, Jack said, watching her with a fondness that bordered on reverence. Thank you, Jack, she whispered, cradling the gift with tenderness. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and in that exchange, a silent promise was forged, one of friendship and, perhaps, the tender shoots of something more. Come, he said with a wink, let's introduce you two properly. And don't worry, I've already spoken with David and Susan about you keeping her in the house. Jane's fingers trembled as the last ribbon fell away, revealing a tiny ball of fur nestled within soft cotton. A small meow escaped from the package, and Jane's lips parted in awe. The kitten was white and ginger, with clear blue eyes. Jack, she's beautiful, Jane whispered. Jack smiled, found her all alone by the barn. Couldn't leave her to fend for herself. Thank you, truly. Jane watched the kitten stumble onto the grass. A living creature is no trifling gift. Nothing trifling about it, Jack said earnestly. You're part of this land now, Jane. And every bit of life on it is a testament to belonging. The kitten began exploring, sniffing at wildflowers dotting the landscape. Seems like she's making herself right at home, Jack noted. I'll take good care of her. Promise, Jane replied. I don't doubt it for a second, Jack said warmly. We weren't allowed to have pets at the Foundling Home, she explained. I always wanted a kitten. As they stood watching the kitten, it seemed to bounce straight up in the air from the grass and then down as it landed on its feet. Over and over the kitten did the same thing, and Jane couldn't help but giggle. The tiny little creature was hers, and she couldn't wait to watch her grow. The following day, Jane's sisters came to visit. Cradling the kitten, Jane's face lit up with love. The small creature, with fur like down and eyes resembling the moon's solitude, purred softly in her hands. Sweet Nilla, she murmured, naming the kitten after memories of laughter and vanilla-scented afternoons from Mrs. Jackson's kitchen. It seemed fitting, as if it had been waiting for her. Come, sisters, meet Nilla, Jane called excitedly, approaching the house where her siblings gathered. Amy and the others turned, curious. As Jane drew near, she presented the kitten gently, evidence of their instant connection. Jack found her by the barn, Jane said, still in disbelief. Now she's mine. Exclamations of delight filled the air as they reached out with gentle fingers, allowing Nilla to sniff them and earn her trust with familiar patience. She nestles right into you, Hannah observed, touched by the sight. Warm smiles surrounded them. Jack knew I would love her, Jane whispered, feeling gratitude well up inside. Well, thank him properly. A true gentleman, Imogene replied with a chuckle. As each took turns stroking Nilla's fur, Jane experienced a deep sense of belonging, one that went beyond walls or fences but lived in shared joys and loved ones' hearts. Jane stood at the edge of the dance floor, her gown reflecting the lantern's golden light. Susan had a collection of dresses that she was allowing Jane to wear, and Jane had never felt so fancy in her life. Her thoughts were with Jack's smile and Nilla's warmth against her neck. Duty and propriety urged her toward the eligible bachelors. Miss Brown, may I have this dance? Asked Mr. Collins, his earnest face above his outstretched hand. Certainly, Jane replied, executing the waltz steps gracefully. Yet her gaze wandered to the ranch's shadowed outline in the twilight sky. As Jane danced at the edge of the dance floor in her borrowed fancy gown, twirling gracefully with Mr. Collins, her mind couldn't help but wander back to Nilla's playful antics. And when she thought of little Nilla, Jack always popped into her mind. In the midst of the elegant waltz, she couldn't shake off the image of Nilla bouncing straight up in the air like a little furry acrobat. Maybe, she thought wistfully, Nilla had some hidden rodeo talents waiting to be unleashed, a bronco-bucking kitten champion in the making. She chuckled to herself, imagining Nilla wearing a tiny cowboy hat and riding on a miniature saddle. Surely, that would be a sight to behold at the next rodeo event. Move over, broncos, here comes the wild kitten rider. At the rodeo, Jane cheered beside Mr. Evans as broncos bucked wildly. His tales of riding exploits failed to captivate her. She thought of Jack's confident tenderness with horses. During Sunday picnics, gentlemen shared ambitions and dreams. Amid homemade bread and preserves, Jane's thoughts returned to quiet conversations with Jack that lingered in her heart. Outings with suitors became a monotonous dance of courtship. She followed decorum but yearned for true connection, the kind effortlessly formed with Jack. In nightly prayers, Jane sought guidance, hoping for a sign leading to genuine affection and lasting companionship. Her heart seemed to have accepted Jack, but none of the others. And Jack's future didn't seem as secure to her. She knew that shouldn't matter, but being raised in a foundling home made security a little more important to her than it would be to most women. Amidst the lively rodeo crowd, Jane's attention strayed from an eager suitor to the dusty ring and bucking broncos. She compared their showmanship to Jack's quiet strength on the ranch. Later, at a picnic, another suitor boasted of his future ambitions. Although she listened politely, Jane felt disconnected, her thoughts turning instead to deep conversations shared with Jack. "Miss Brown, you do agree, don't you?" the suitor pressed. "Of course," Jane murmured, having no idea what the man had said. Seeking solitude, Jane followed the sound of a nearby brook. The water's rushing reminded her of how Jack had shown her peace in nature. "Seems like you could use some company," said Jack, leaning against a tree. Together, they returned to the stables and tended to the animals side by side. Their movements harmonious and familiar. "Jane," Jack began, "you ever think about what tomorrow might bring?" "Every day," she confessed. "Though I find myself more concerned with today lately." "Today's got its charm, especially with good company," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I agree," Jane whispered, emotions welling up within her. Each moment with Jack silently intertwined itself into her heart's tapestry, a design no other could weave. "Jack," she said, barely audible, but hesitated, torn between confession and uncertainty. "Whatever it is, Jane, you can tell me." "Always," he replied earnestly. "Thank you, Jack," she said, yearning for his unwavering comfort. Though unready to express her deepest feelings, she knew where she longed to be, by his side on a ranch, immersed in their genuine connection. For now, she would cherish these moments, as her heart navigated its own truth. Jane brushed down old Bess. The rhythmic strokes and soft nickers brought her solace, but it barely scratched the surface of her internal conflict. "Easy now, Bess," she murmured. Months had passed since Jack had given her Nilla, the kitten who confidently roamed the stables. With each day, Jane's affection for Jack grew, yet her pragmatic side wrestled with the romantic notions filling her heart. As twilight approached, she leaned against the stall door. Society expected her to entertain her suitors, their intentions as orderly as their Sunday best. She did so, though each smile felt borrowed from another woman. "Jane, you've got that look again," Susan remarked from the barn doorway, embodying domestic authority. "What look?" Jane feigned ignorance. "The one where your mind's here, but your heart's off with someone else." Susan's eyes sparkled with mischief and gentle chiding. "Is it so obvious?" Jane sighed. "Only to those who know you well," Susan reassured. "But you can't keep this up. You owe it to yourself, and to them, to be honest." "I know," Jane whispered, feeling guilty about her dance of decorum around the truth of her affections. "Perhaps I should pray on it," she suggested hollowly. "Prayer is always wise," Susan agreed. "But don't forget to listen to what your heart whispers back. It's often wiser than we give it credit for." "Thank you, Susan," Jane replied, watching Susan return to the house as lights flickered on. A quiet resolve settled over her under the emerging stars. Tonight, she would host another dinner, playing society's assigned role. But tomorrow, she would seek out Jack beneath the expansive Texas sky, where only their expectations mattered. Jane stood on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was filled with bluebonnet fragrance and distant cattle sounds. Her dusty skirts seemed unimportant as she considered her future. Should she choose practicality or passion? "Jane, Mr. Harper will be here shortly," Susan called cheerfully from inside. Nodding, Jane's gaze fell upon Jack leading a horse in the far field, his laughter reaching her over the sound of the bridle. His genuine presence cut through her uncertainty. It wasn't just his smile or his eyes. Jack Stewart captured her heart entirely. "Enough," Jane whispered, stepping off the porch with newfound resolve. That night, amidst polite smiles and conversation, Jane's thoughts lingered on Jack. She imagined him beneath the stars, unaware of her decision taking shape. As guests left and her sisters excitedly speculated about potential matches, one urged, "Jane, you must consider who can offer you the most." But Jane knew where her heart truly lay. "But I don't care who can give me diamonds, when I'll be happy with a necklace of flowers," Jane replied. Another chimed in, "Yes, and think of the security. Mr. Harper has land, wealth." Jane's thoughts wandered to a dark-haired man as she squeezed her sister's hands. "Thank you both," she whispered, happy to have Imogene and Hannah with her. "But my heart whispers something quite contrary." She retreated to her room, leaving her sisters puzzled. Alone by the window, moonlight illuminated the wooden floorboards. A prayer for strength slipped from her lips. "Jack," she breathed into the night, her decision ringing clear and true, not driven by convenience or arrangement, but by an undeniable love offering no certainty except its existence. In that quiet hour, Jane Brown embraced the truth that Jack Stewart held her heart captive. All that remained was the courage to act upon it. Jane adjusted her blouse in front of the mirror, then took a deep breath to calm herself. It was time to confess her feelings to Jack, hoping it would change their future together. As twilight settled over the ranch, Jane found Jack by the stables, brushing down a horse. "Evening, Jane," he greeted warmly. "What brings you out here at this hour?" "Jack, I came because there's something important I need to say," she said, clasping her hands for courage. She stepped closer to the fence that separated them. "It's about us, or rather, the possibility of an U.S. My heart seems to have a mind of its own. And it appears quite smitten with you, Jack Stewart." Her confession hung between them, fragile and vulnerable. The intensity in his eyes gave Jane hope as Jack closed the distance between them. "Jane, I've been open about my feelings for you," Jack confessed, his voice warm. "Hearing you say you care means everything." "Let's not waste any more time apart," Jane said, her voice gaining confidence. "Let's build our life here, among the creatures and land we both love." Jack smiled genuinely. "Nothing would make me happier." Jack took a step closer to Jane and cupped her face in his hands, slowly lowering his head so he could touch his lips to hers. Jane's heart raced as Jack's lips met hers in a gentle, tender kiss. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down her spine, and she found herself melting into his embrace. When they finally parted, Jane looked up at Jack with shining eyes, a soft smile gracing her features. "I've dreamed of this moment," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle rustling of the leaves in the evening breeze. "I probably shouldn't admit it, but I have, and I'm not ashamed." Jack brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek, a smile tilting up the corners of his lips. "As have I, Jane. From the moment I first laid eyes on you, I knew you were special. Your kindness, your spirit, it captured my heart in a way I never thought possible." Jane leaned into his touch, savoring the feeling of his rough, work-worn hands against her skin. "I tried to deny it at first, telling myself it was just a passing fancy. But with each day spent in your company, each conversation we shared, I found myself falling deeper." Jack wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her close. "No more denying, Jane. Let's embrace these feelings we've found and build a life together. I may not have much to offer in terms of material wealth, but I promise to love you with all my heart and soul." "That's all I could ever ask for," Jane replied, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of joy. "Thank you for being patient with me as I was courted by other men." Jane and Jack shared another tender kiss beneath the glowing Texas sunset, their hearts overflowing with the joy and promise of a shared future. As they slowly parted, Jack took Jane's hand in his own, interlacing their fingers. "Jane, I want to do this right," he said earnestly. "I know it's not traditional, but would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly?" A radiant smile spread across Jane's face. "Jack, nothing would make me happier. I want to walk this path with you, side by side, as equals." Hand in hand, they strolled back towards the ranch house, their laughter mingling with the gentle sounds of the evening. As they approached the porch, Susan and David emerged, their expressions a mix of curiosity and knowing smiles. "Well now, what do we have here?" David asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief as he took in the sight of Jane and Jack's intertwined hands. Jane blushed and looked down. Jack seemed a bit embarrassed as well. "We've decided to court," he said, smiling down at Jane. "It's about time," Susan said. "I knew it would happen from the moment I met Jane. You two just belong together." As she said goodnight to Jack, Jane couldn't help but wonder how life would be married to a cowboy, and not a rancher as she'd imagined. Jack was special enough that she knew she had to give him a chance to show her that life. Chapter 6. Jane sat at the kitchen table, flanked by her sisters Imogene and Cassandra. Late afternoon light warmed the worn wooden surface, enhancing the enthusiasm in Imogene's eyes and Cassandra's determined expression. They excitedly discussed the eligible suitors who had shown interest in Jane. "Benjamin has an impressive build," Imogene gushed, "while Thomas possesses a head for numbers." Despite their suggestions, Jane remained resolute. "I appreciate your efforts, but I have chosen to court Jack." Imogene and Cassandra sighed but conceded. "Very well," Imogene said, standing up and heading toward the pantry. "Let's focus on preparing tonight's meal." As they gathered ingredients for stew, Jane found solace in cooking for her loved ones. Imogene and Cassandra shared her enthusiasm as they peeled and chopped, their camaraderie untainted by worries about the future. The rhythm of evening preparations offered them respite from life's more complex decisions. Cassandra leaned against the kitchen counter, her posture unusually rigid. "Jane," she began, tension evident in her voice, "I find myself in an unexpected condition." Jane paused in her task, flour dusting her fingers. "Cassandra," she prompted gently. "I am with child," Cassandra confessed, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the wooden table. A hush fell over the kitchen. Jane closed the distance between them and embraced her sister. "Oh, Cassandra," she murmured. "We shall weather this tempest together." Jane knew her sister had never wanted children, so for her to be expecting after only 6 months of marriage, she knew Cassandra would be sad. "Thank you, Jane," Cassandra replied softly. As Jane returned to the task at hand, thoughts of Jack filled her mind, his earnest smile and gentle crinkling eyes. A man of humble means, but rich in character, he had captured her heart. Yet doubt wound its way through her certainty. Could Jack provide for a family as she had always dreamed of? "Jane," called Imogene, "do you reckon this stew needs more time?" "Perhaps just a pinch," Jane answered, her voice distant. Imogene chuckled lightly. "Your thoughts are as scattered as mustangs on the run. Come back to us." Jane offered a faint smile, appreciating Imogene's effort to refocus her thoughts. She found comfort in the kitchen routines, stirring the stew and kneading bread. Yet as she cared for physical needs, she wondered if love alone could support the future she envisioned. Imogene watched Jane slice the carrots, her cuts jagged and uneven. "Jane," Imogene said, leaning closer, "your carrots look as wild as Mr. Thompson's untamed curls. Let's gather our wits, shall we?" Jane paused, giggling at the orange crescents on the cutting board. "I could give Mr. Thompson a run for his money," she admitted. "You could," Imogene chuckled, nudging Jane playfully. They resumed their kitchen dance, the rhythm of chopping and stirring soothing Jane's worries away. "Imogene, thank you," Jane sighed, a lightness in her voice. "Anytime, darling," Imogene replied with a warm smile. They finished setting the table, and the meal stood ready, a testament to their labor of love. As they bowed their heads to pray before dinner with Cassandra and Andrew, Jane felt gratitude chase away her doubts in the company of loved ones and a comforting meal. Cassandra served the stew, breaking the silence. "Andrew, wouldn't you agree that Mr. Thompson has taken an interest in Jane?" "He has," Andrew replied with amusement, glancing at Jane. Her cheeks flushed, and she said, "Mr. Thompson is very kind." Her thoughts, however, lingered on Jack. Imogene added, "Kind, yes, and quite prosperous too. He owns the largest farm this side of the Brazos." "Prosperity isn't everything," Jane muttered. Cassandra reassured her, "Of course not, but it doesn't hurt when choosing a husband." The meal continued with lively chatter from the sisters, but Jane's mind remained elsewhere. As they finished eating, she found solace in clearing the table and washing the dishes. As she scrubbed a pot, her thoughts turned to future sacrifices as a wife and mother. Cassandra noticed Jane's furrowed brow. Are you all right? Just thinking about the future, Jane confessed. It's a serious matter, choosing your life's path, Cassandra said. Remember, it's yours to choose. Thank you, Cassandra, Jane said gratefully. They fell into a rhythm of wash and dry together, a comforting routine they had shared many times over the years. As the stack of clean dishes grew, Jane's resolve strengthened. Whatever tomorrow might bring, her sister's love and support eased the prospect of an unconventional choice like Jack. Jane placed the last dish in the rack, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Jack. The warm, fragrant kitchen seemed to close in on her with each passing moment. Imogene hummed as she entered the room, her bright presence dissipating Jane's gloom. She joined in cleaning, wiping down counters energetically. Jeannie, you're a sight for sore eyes, Cassandra chuckled, handing her a damp cloth. Someone's got to be the ray of sunshine around here, Imogene said, eyes twinkling as she cleaned the countertop. Jane laughed softly, admiring Imogene's graceful movements. Her sister was like sunlight nurturing a garden, spreading warmth wherever she went. Jeannie, your cheer is as bountiful as your curiosity, Jane teased. Curiosity is the spice of life, Imogene responded playfully. As they finished tidying up the kitchen together, Cassandra expressed gratitude for Jane's help that day. Their reassurances warmed Jane, but also stirred an uneasy feeling about taking risks. Thank you both, she replied quietly. I cherish your support. We'll be there to adjust the sails with you, Imogene promised and rested her hand on Jane's shoulder. Cassandra nodded in agreement. We trust your heart, Jane. Jack is unlike any other, Jane admitted, surprised by her own conviction. There's something about him. Hold fast to that something, Imogene urged. In love, sometimes that's our only guide. As they extinguished the kitchen lamp, moonlight seeped through the window. Jane knew the true test of her decision lay within herself. Jane slipped through the back door, stepping out into the night. The cold air kissed her cheeks, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the bustling household. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, finding solace in the fabric's whisper. The vast Texas sky stretched above her, a tapestry of stars. She traced the constellations, seeking counsel from their quiet beauty. As her breath formed clouds in the winter air, her thoughts began to crystallize. Guide me, Lord, she whispered, an affirmation of faith. Let my heart be steadfast. A sense of purpose bloomed within her as she turned back toward the house. She entered the parlor, where Imogene and Cassandra sat mending by the fire. Their heads lifted in unison. Jane, Cassandra said gently, you look as if you've had a revelation. I have, Jane replied with a slight smile. The stars have a way of offering perspective. What has your heart decided? Imogene asked eagerly. Taking a steadying breath, Jane announced, I've made my choice. I wish for Jack to court me. Her voice was steady and clear. He may not have the wealth that I was hoping for, but his heart is just what I need in life. Imogene clapped her hands together. Oh, Jane. I'm so happy for you. She rushed over and embraced her sister tightly. Cassandra set aside her mending and rose to join them, a soft smile gracing her lips. You've chosen well, Jane. Jack is a fine man. Jane returned their hugs, grateful for their support. Thank you both. I know it's not the most conventional choice, but it feels right in my heart. Convention be damned, Imogene declared with a grin. Love should guide our paths, not societal expectations. Cassandra nodded sagely. I agree with Jeannie. And I have a feeling Jack will prove himself more than worthy. As they settled back into their seats by the fire, Jane felt a lightness in her spirit. The path ahead might not be easy, but with her sisters by her side and Jack in her heart, she knew she could face any challenge. The next morning, Jane awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. She dressed with care, selecting a simple yet elegant gown that complemented her figure. As she pinned her hair into place, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, and a rosy hue graced her cheeks. Descending the stairs, Jane found Susan already in the kitchen with Mrs. Hackenschleimer, the family's longtime housekeeper. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the scent of sizzling bacon. Susan looked up from the stove, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Good morning, Susan," she greeted warmly. "You look positively radiant." Jane returned Susan's smile, feeling a flush of excitement. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Hackenschleimer. It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," the older woman agreed, her eyes twinkling knowingly. "And I suspect it will be an especially wonderful day for you, Jane." Jane bit her lip, trying to contain her giddiness. "I do hope so. Jack is planning to come by later and take me for a walk." Mrs. Hackenschleimer looked up from kneading dough. "Ah, young love. It's a precious thing, Jane. Nurture it well." "I intend to, Mrs. Hackenschleimer," Jane replied, her heart swelling with affection for the kind housekeeper who had been very welcoming to her. Jane helped set the table for breakfast. As she arranged the plates and silverware, her mind wandered to the upcoming walk with Jack. She couldn't help but smile at the thought of spending time alone with him, away from the watchful eyes of the bustling household. "Someone's in a good mood this morning," Susan teased, placing a platter of bacon on the table. Jane laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "Oh, my dear, you're practically glowing," Mrs. Hackenschleimer chuckled. "It's a joy to see you so happy." As the family gathered for breakfast, the conversation flowed easily. David spoke of the new horses he was training, while Susan talked about her latest sewing project. Daisy, Susan's youngest, regaled them with the tale of her misadventure in the garden involving a mischievous rabbit. Jane listened attentively, her heart full of love for this family, who treated her as if she was one of them. After the meal, Jane helped Mrs. Hackenschleimer clear the table and wash the dishes. As they worked side by side, the housekeeper spoke softly. "Jane, you've chosen a suitor well. Jack is a good man, and he'll never betray you. That's more important than all the money in the world." Jane smiled at the praise of the older woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Hackenschleimer. That means more to me than you know." The older woman patted Jane's hand affectionately. "Now, you go on and enjoy your time with Jack. I'll finish up here." With a grateful smile, Jane untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. She smoothed her skirts and took a deep breath, excitement fluttering in her chest as she stepped out onto the porch. Jane made her way down the path, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Jack. Her heart skipped a beat when she spotted a familiar figure riding toward the house. Jack's broad shoulders and easy smile sent a thrill through her as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "Good morning, Jane," he greeted, tipping his hat. His dark eyes sparkled with warmth as he took in her appearance. "You look mighty pretty today." Jane felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you, Jack. I've been looking forward to our walk." "As have I," he said. "I think all I've done is dream about this walk since we agreed to spend the time together today." He noticed she wasn't wearing a shawl. "It's cold today. You should grab a shawl to keep you warm." Jane nodded. "Give me just a moment and I'll be ready." She dashed back into the house, grabbed her shawl, and hurried back outside. She knew she shouldn't rush, because she would seem too eager, but that didn't seem to matter. No, what mattered was spending time with Jack. Chapter 7. Jane and Jack strolled along the path to the river, sharing stories and laughter. Jane regaled Jack with a humorous tale from her days at the orphanage. "One summer, when I was about 12, a traveling circus passed through town. Well, we orphans were beside ourselves with excitement, having never seen such a spectacle before. So, a group of us hatched a plan to sneak out and catch a glimpse of the exotic animals and performers." Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she continued. "We waited until the matron was distracted, then slipped out the back gate, giggling. But when we finally reached the circus grounds, we discovered they had only a mangy old lion and a few tired-looking acrobats. It was nothing like the grand affair we'd imagined." Jack chuckled, picturing a young Jane and her friends' crestfallen expressions. "I suppose it's true what they say, anticipation is often sweeter than reality," he mused. "Still, I bet it was quite an adventure for a group of spirited young girls." "Oh, it was," Jane agreed, her laughter ringing out. And the real excitement came when we tried to sneak back into the orphanage undetected. We thought we were being so stealthy, tiptoeing up the creaky stairs in our bare feet. But just as we reached the top, Mrs. Jackson appeared out of nowhere. Jane's eyes widened as she recounted the scene. We froze like startled rabbits, certain our goose was cooked. But then, the most extraordinary thing happened. Mrs. Jackson's frown slowly transformed into a smile, and she said, "I hope you girls had a good time at the circus. Now, off to bed with you, and let's keep this our little secret." We couldn't believe our luck. Jack chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. "Mrs. Jackson sounds like a real character. I can just picture the lot of you, wide-eyed and guilty, waiting for the axe to fall." She was full of surprises, that one, Jane agreed, a fond smile playing on her lips. Like the time she caught us trying to sneak a litter of kittens into the house. We had found them abandoned and couldn't bear to leave them to fend for themselves. So, we smuggled them in, tucked away in our apron pockets and the folds of our skirts. She giggled at the memory. We thought we were being so clever, but Mrs. Jackson had a nose like a bloodhound. She marched right up to us, hands on her hips, and demanded to know what we were hiding. We tried to play innocent, but then one of the kittens let out a tiny mew. Jane's eyes danced with laughter as she continued. We expected a scolding, but instead, Mrs. Jackson just sighed and said, "Well, I suppose we can't very well turn away God's little creatures, can we? But you girls will be responsible for their care." And just like that, we became the proud guardians of 4 mischievous kittens. She smiled at the memory. Those kittens brought so much joy to the orphanage. They'd scamper through the halls, pouncing on dust motes and chasing their own tails. And when they'd finally tire themselves out, they'd curl up in our laps, purring contentedly. She shook her head. We had to find homes for them right away because the orphanage couldn't support them. It was hard to let go. Jane's smile widened as another memory surfaced. "Oh, and then there was the time we decided to put on a play for the younger children. We spent weeks rehearsing, fashioning costumes out of old sheets and curtains. I was cast as the fairy godmother, complete with a wand made from a stick and a star cut out of tin foil." She chuckled, shaking her head. The night of the performance, everything that could go wrong, did. The makeshift stage collapsed, sending poor Brenda tumbling into the audience. My wand got stuck in my hair, and Hannah, who was playing the wicked stepmother, tripped over her own feet and fell into the punch bowl. Jane's laughter rang out, infectious and joyous. But the children loved it. They cheered and clapped, thinking it was all part of the show, and when we took our bows at the end, they leaped to their feet, demanding an encore. Jack grinned, picturing the chaos and hilarity of the scene. "It sounds like you girls knew how to make your own fun." "We did," Jane agreed, her eyes soft with nostalgia. Those days were filled with laughter and mischief, even though we didn't have much in the way of material possessions. We had each other, and that was enough. She paused, a distant look in her eyes, then chuckled softly. "I remember one winter, when the snow was so deep it nearly reached the windowsills. We were all going stir-crazy, cooped up inside for days on end. So, Mrs. Jackson suggested we have a snowman building contest." Jane's eyes sparkled with laughter as she continued. "We divided into teams and set to work, determined to create the most magnificent snowman the orphanage had ever seen. My team decided to build a snow queen, complete with a crown made of icicles and a gown of shimmering frost. We spent hours shaping and sculpting, our cheeks rosy from the cold and our laughter echoing across the snowy expanse. But our rivals had a trick up their sleeves. They had managed to smuggle a sack of coal from the kitchen, and they used it to give their snowman eyes, a nose, and a wide, mischievous grin. When Mrs. Jackson came out to judge the contest, she took one look at their creation and burst out laughing. "Why, it looks just like Reverend Tompkins," she exclaimed. Jane's eyes danced with merriment as she recounted another tale from her orphanage days. "Oh, and then there was the time we decided to surprise Mrs. Jackson with a special feast for her birthday. We spent days planning the menu, gathering ingredients, and practicing our cooking skills in secret. Hannah even managed to convince the baker to donate a beautiful cake, which we decorated with wildflowers and sugar glaze. When the big day arrived, we shooed Mrs. Jackson out of the kitchen, insisting that she take a well-deserved rest. We set to work, peeling potatoes, chopping vegetables, and stirring pots with great enthusiasm. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, filled with laughter, chatter, and the tantalizing aromas of our culinary creations, but our inexperience soon became apparent. The potatoes turned out lumpy, the vegetables were more charred than roasted, and the gravy had the consistency of glue. We stood back, surveying the disaster with dismay, wondering how we could possibly serve such a meal to our beloved matron. But then, inspiration struck. We decided to turn it into a game, presenting each dish with a flourish and a silly name. The lumpy potatoes became mashed marvelous, the burnt vegetables were charred champions, and the gravy was dubbed gluey goodness. We set the table with mismatched china and wildflowers, giggling as we imagined Mrs. Jackson's reaction. When we finally led her into the dining room, blindfolded and giddy with anticipation, Mrs. Jackson let out a gasp of surprise. She surveyed the table, taking in the lopsided cake, the oddly named dishes, and our eager, expectant faces. For a moment, we held our breath, fearing disappointment or disapproval. But then, Mrs. Jackson's face split into a wide, beaming smile. "Why, this is the most marvelous feast I've ever seen." She insisted on trying every dish, praising the mashed marvelous for its hearty texture and the charred champions for their bold flavor. When she tasted the gluey goodness, she laughed heartily, proclaiming it a culinary marvel. We joined in her laughter, relief and joy mingling in our hearts. As we sat around the table, savoring the cake and sharing stories, Mrs. Jackson's eyes misted with emotion. "Girls," she said softly, "this is the most wonderful birthday gift I could have ever received. Not because I didn't have to cook, but because you put a great deal of thought and love into it." Jane paused, her eyes sparkling with another memory. "Oh, I have to tell you about the time we decided to put on a talent show. We spent weeks preparing, each of us determined to showcase our unique skills. Hannah insisted on performing a dramatic recitation of Shakespeare, complete with elaborate costumes and props. She spent hours practicing, pacing the halls and gesturing wildly as she recited lines from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Brenda, on the other hand, fancied herself a singer. She would belt out hymns at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing through the orphanage halls. We all cringed a bit when she hit the high notes, but her enthusiasm was infectious. And then there was Amy, our resident artist. She spent days creating a giant mural, a whimsical scene filled with fantastical creatures and swirling colors. Jane's eyes twinkled with mirth as she recounted the grand finale of their talent show. "I had been practicing a special dance routine in secret. I had fashioned a costume out of an old sheet, adorning it with ribbons and wildflowers. When the big night arrived, I took to the stage, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. But as I began to twirl and leap, disaster struck. My foot caught on the hem of my makeshift gown, sending me tumbling head over heels. I landed in a heap, my skirt flipped over my head and my bloomers on full display." Jane paused, giggling at the memory. The audience erupted in laughter, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. But then, something extraordinary happened. Hannah, who had been waiting in the wings for her cue, rushed onto the stage. She struck a dramatic pose and declared, "Fear not, fair maiden, for I shall save thee from showing thy bloomers to the world." And with that, she whipped off her own cloak and draped it over my upturned skirts, covering my bloomers with a flourish. The audience roared with laughter and applause as Hannah helped me to my feet. We took a bow together, grinning from ear to ear, and then, one by one, the other girls joined us on stage. Brenda belted out a verse of amazing grace, while Amy unfurled her mural like a banner. We linked arms and took a final bow. "It was a moment I'll never forget," Jane said, her eyes misty with nostalgia. "We may have been orphans, but we had each other. And that was all that mattered." They walked a little further in silence, listening to the sounds coming from the river. "Did you hear about the calf that escaped from McCoy's last Tuesday?" Jack asked. "Can't say I have," Jane replied. "It ended up in the pastor's vegetable garden, ate almost all of his lettuce, before they found it." I have a feeling Hannah was not amused. They laughed heartily, their joy echoing along the riverbank. As they reached the water's edge, they sat on a patch of lush grass, watching ripples dance across the surface. "Jane," Jack began softly, "I think there's something special in moments like this." Her heart fluttered with hopeful anticipation. He leaned in, offering her a tender kiss filled with promises of a sweet future together. As they walked back toward Susan and David's house later that day, Jack paused and invited Jane to Brenda's Christmas party. Her heart swelled with nerves and excitement as she accepted. The following afternoon at Cassandra's, Jane requested help making a dress for the upcoming party, something really special. "Thank you," Jane whispered, a sincere smile gracing her lips. Each stitch and seam melded dreams with fabric, anticipation growing for the enchanting evening ahead. Jane and her sisters gathered in the living room. Brenda, Amy, and Hannah, all visibly pregnant, were engaged in familial conversation accompanied by the scent of fresh-baked bread and tea. "Tim has been working as hard as he can to get the firewood we need for the winter." Amy laughed while patting her belly. "Which is good news. This little one seems to always make me cold." Hannah smiled as she crocheted. "Maybe your chill is nature's reminder to slow down and savor the moment." Jane observed her sisters with amusement before asking, "Have any of you considered names yet?" "Jonathan if it's a boy," Brenda replied, "and Grace if it's a girl." "We're torn between Samuel and Benjamin," Amy added. Hannah set aside her crochet. "Names carry such weight, a single word defining so much of who we are." After a moment, the talk of names died down. "I know," Jane said. "You should all name all of your daughters Jane, and tell them it's because I'm their favorite aunt." Jane wasn't surprised when Brenda hit her in the face with a pillow as they all laughed at the idea. Jane's gaze lingered on the curve of Brenda's abdomen. The summer breeze carried distant sounds from David's stables and rustling leaves of the ancient oak near their house. "Isn't it a marvel?" Jane whispered, imagining the connection between mother and child. "Jane?" Brenda asked. "I can't help but feel envious," Jane confessed, voicing her hidden longing. Brenda offered a reassuring look. "You'll have your time, little sister." "But isn't it terrifying, Brenda?" Jane asked softly, seeking reassurance behind Brenda's strength. "The responsibility and sacrifices?" Brenda grabbed Jane's hand. "Of course it's terrifying, but those fears mix with hope and excitement. You learn to embrace it all." Brenda gave Jane's hand a final pat before releasing it. "You've seen me, all swollen and complaining about my aching back, haven't you?" she asked, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "And yet, here I am, eager for this baby and all the babies to follow. The love and joy a child brings, they're worth every sleepless night and every stretch mark." "Really?" Jane's skepticism was evident, but Brenda's nod was confident. "Truly," Brenda affirmed. Jane mulled over Brenda's words as she followed the savory aroma that wafted from the kitchen. Amy stood at the stove, her apron dusted with flour, stirring something in a large pot with the same care she might cradle a newborn. She glanced up, her smile warm as the oven's glow. "Come here, Jane. Let me show you how to make Tim's favorite stew." Amy beckoned her closer, handing her a wooden spoon. "It's all about patience and knowing just when to add each ingredient." As Jane took the spoon, she felt a kinship with the process, the gradual building of flavors, the nurturing of warmth. Amy guided her hand as they added carrots, then potatoes, timing each addition as if composing a symphony of tastes. "Seems like there's a knack to this," Jane observed, watching the ingredients meld together under her careful stir. "Like most things worth doing," Amy agreed, tucking a stray hair behind her ear, her movements fluid and assured. "It takes practice, and there'll be mistakes. But in time, you learn the rhythms, the signs of when something needs a little more time or a bit less heat." A thoughtful silence fell between them, punctuated only by the bubbling of the stew and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables on the cutting board. In the simple act of cooking, Jane found an unexpected peace, a sense of what it might be to tend to a family with the same devotion. "Thank you," Jane said after a while, the gratitude in her voice extending far beyond the culinary lesson. "For showing me." "Anytime, sister." Amy smiled at Jane. "There's plenty more where that came from." And you know I've always enjoyed teaching you to cook new things. And with that, the seeds of confidence were sown in the fertile soil of Jane's heart, watered by the nurturing wisdom of her sisters. Jane carefully followed Amy's instructions as she kneaded bread dough. "You're a natural, Jane," Amy smiled. "Your little ones will never know hunger with you in the kitchen." Jane blushed, envisioning a table surrounded by family and filled with warmth. But as nightfall approached, doubt crept into her heart. Later, Jane found Hannah crocheting intricate patterns in the living room. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice heavy. "Of course not," Hannah replied calmly. "Hannah," Jane hesitated. "Do you ever fear losing yourself when you become a mother?" Hannah paused and looked up at Jane. "It's a fair concern. Motherhood demands much and can change you." "Change how?" Jane sought clarity. "Priorities shift," Hannah explained evenly. "Your needs often come second to those of your child." "But is it worth it?" Jane searched Hannah's eyes for reassurance. "Many say it is," Hannah said, returning to her work. "But each woman's journey is her own. I think I will be the happiest woman alive when I hold my child in my arms." "Thank you, Hannah," Jane whispered gratefully. "Motherhood isn't the only path to fulfillment, Jane," Hannah said, her fingers never ceasing their dance with the yarn. "Just as each stitch here serves a purpose, so too does every choice we make for ourselves." Later, Jane paced on the porch, her boots creaking on the wooden boards. The twilight deepened and the Texas sky filled with stars, reflecting her inner turmoil. "Lord," she murmured, "I know you've heard my pondering all day. Maybe it's time I listened for your answer." Eyes closed, Jane inhaled the sense of earth and growth that surrounded her. A warmth blossomed within, mirroring a yearning for a child born from love rather than societal expectations. "Goodness gracious," she whispered, laughter bubbling forth. "This ain't about what others think I ought to do. This is about the home and family I want to build." Imagining tiny feet pattering in a small house and a sweet voice calling her mama, her heart swelled. "All right, then," Jane said resolutely, eyes seeking the heavens as if to gain their blessing. "I may not know the first thing about being a mother, but I've got a heart full of love and 2 hands ready to work." "Let it be, Lord," she declared with newfound determination. "For every sacrifice, there'll be joy tenfold." With her decision made, Jane stepped off the porch, ready to not only marry but to embrace motherhood with courage and immense love. Chapter 8. The waters of the Trinity River shimmered under the waning sun as Jack and Jane stepped onto the steamboat's deck. Fort Worth's banks dissolved into the horizon. "Quite the sight," Jack said, the churning water echoing his voice. "I can't imagine a more beautiful place to watch the sunset." Jane hugged her shawl tighter against the river breeze. Seeing her shiver, Jack placed his coat over her shoulders. "Thank you," she replied, cheeks flushed from more than just the cold. His coat was warm from his skin, and it felt so good she wanted to lose herself in it. Onward they journeyed, hands intertwined. "Jane, there's something I need to ask." He revealed a ring, old, adorned with intricate engravings and a star-like stone. "This belonged to my mother. Now I want it to be yours." Heart racing, Jane sought confirmation in his eyes. Could he really mean? "Jane," he said, "will you marry me?" Overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions, Jane's fingers trembled as they grazed the ring. "You can take your time," he assured her, sensing hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered. As twilight painted the sky, Jane pondered his proposal and the priceless heirloom in her hand. Uncertainties lingered like shadows at her thought's edge, but one revelation emerged crystal clear: her answer was yes. The steamboat's paddle wheel churned the Trinity waters, ripples gliding like dancers. Jane watched Jack, his silhouette framed by fading light. Their uncertain future stretched before her, akin to the untamed Texas frontier. "Jane?" Jack's hopeful voice tugged at her resolve. Inhaling crisp air, she found courage. "Yes," she whispered over the river's rush. "I will marry you." Jack's radiant smile dissolved Jane's concerns momentarily. As they made their way back to the Dailies' home, however, uncertainty rekindled within her chest. That evening, with children asleep, Susan knit in the parlor. The needle's clicks filled the silence. Jack asked me to marry him today, Jane murmured. Susan paused her knitting and looked up. And? We're to be married, said Jane, a mix of sweetness and bitterness. She'd always told herself she wouldn't marry a man who didn't own his own house and have a way to earn a living, but she felt too much for Jack to hold herself to it. Why look so somber? Susan asked gently. I'm happy but afraid of the unknown. Susan nodded slowly. A new chapter can be frightening. But love often guides us through uncertainty. Jane smiled faintly, comforted yet adrift in a sea of what-ifs. As night deepened and Susan resumed knitting, Jane clung to the rhythmic sound, an anchor amidst her turbulent thoughts. Jane fidgeted with the locket at her throat, a relic from her orphanage days. Susan watched her, silently encouraging. Jack is not a cowboy, Jane said hesitantly. I fear we might not have enough to live comfortably. Susan chuckled softly and set her knitting aside. Did you not know? Once you're married, Jack's father plans to move back east. Their ranch will be yours. Unless there is some major catastrophe, you and Jack will never have to worry about money. The ranch? Jane's eyes widened at the thought of vast pastures and security. Yes. Susan's smile was reassuring. You'll have your home, your land, and your cowboy. It's one of the largest ranches in this part of Texas. Why wouldn't he tell me himself? Jane wondered aloud, imagining cattle grazing and fences reaching toward the horizon. Perhaps he assumed you already knew, Susan replied, gently touching Jane's hand. Or maybe he wanted to marry for love alone. Jane smiled at the thought of love beyond riches, warmth blossoming within her like dawn breaking after a long night. As Jane climbed the narrow staircase to her room, Susan's revelation echoed in her mind. She had been captivated by Jack's affections, without considering their future together. Lying in bed, she whispered about Jack's waiting ranch, wondering why he hadn't mentioned it. Her money worries may be over, but that didn't stop all worries. At dawn, Jack knocked on Susan and David's door. Jane greeted him with a furrowed brow. Jack, what brings you here at this hour? She asked. Can't a man visit his betrothed with the dawn? He replied. I have something pressing to discuss. Inside the parlor, Jack clasped his hands and spoke of his father's desire to pass down the ranch and retire back east. He proposed marrying soon. Your father's ranch? Jane repeated. Why have you never spoken of this? I thought everyone knew, Jack said, surprised. A mix of emotions flooded Jane, relief, confusion, and affection for Jack. His confession solidified their future together. Agreeing to marry soon, they joined hands with relieved smiles. Together, they would forge a path under the vast Texas sky, grounded by land and lifted by love. Jane sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the wood grain, lost in thought. The morning sun cast a glow over the sisters as Cassandra spread out fabric swatches of ivory and lace. Jane, what do you think of this one? Cassandra asked, holding up a delicate silk piece. It's beautiful, Jane replied, picturing herself wearing it on her wedding day. I'll start on the dresses straight away, said Cassandra. Amy chimed in, I'll take care of the feast, fresh bread, apple pie, and a hearty stew. We'll get it to the church right before the wedding. Thank you, Jane answered, grateful for her sister's generosity. An intimate wedding with all those we hold dear, Jane mused, thinking of Jack's reaction. Especially when he tastes my cooking, Amy teased, causing laughter among them. With her sister's support, Jane felt ready for life's next great adventure. Jane watched Jack from the porch as he leaned against the fence, his gaze lost on the horizon where the sun began to dip low in the sky. He had that faraway look he often got after a long day working with his hands, and she knew better than to disturb him when he was like this. But the wedding was looming, and her heart fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Jack, she called out gently, hesitant to break his reverie. He turned, a slow smile spreading across his face as he saw her. Evening, Jane. You look beautiful as always. Thank you, Jack. She twisted the fabric of her apron between her fingers, a habit when nerves caught her tongue. I wanted to talk to you about the wedding plans. There's much to decide, and I thought. Whatever you want, Jane, Jack interrupted with an easy shrug, pushing away from the fence and sauntering over to her. I trust your judgment. Her heart sank a little. His nonchalance felt like disinterest, and she couldn't help but voice her concern. But don't you care about our wedding? It's our day, not just mine. Of course I care, he said, his dark eyes meeting hers earnestly. It's just. Well, there's been a lot going on, and Pa's been having me up each night, talking about the ranch. Is something the matter? Jane asked, her brows knitting together in worry. Nothing's wrong, he assured her, his hand finding its way to her shoulder in a comforting squeeze. He's just teaching me everything I need to know. It's important stuff, Jane. One day, all this, he gestured vaguely towards the vast expanse of land that stretched out before them, will be ours to tend to. It's so hard to believe, she said softly, a warmth blossoming within her at the thought of sharing a future so intimately tied to the land and the man before her. Trust me, Jack said, his voice steady and sure. I'm leaving the wedding to you because I trust you'll make it perfect. And besides, he added with a grin, if I started making decisions, we'd end up saying I do on horseback or in the middle of a cattle drive. Jane couldn't help but laugh, the sound mingling with the rustle of the leaves in the evening breeze. In that moment, she understood. His heart was in his work, just as hers was in their future together. Her worries eased, replaced by a sense of purpose. This man, who would one day stand beside her as they faced the world, trusted her with the beginnings of their life together. All right then, she said, her spirit lifting. You focus on learning about the ranch, and I'll handle the wedding. Together, we'll start our new chapter the best way possible. Agreed, Jack replied, his smile reflecting the last rays of sunlight. And Jane? Yes, Jack? Thank you for understanding. Jane watched Jack return to his duties, the deepening twilight surrounding her. Their roles may be different, but their path was shared, bound by love and faith. Jane traced the quilt's patterns as she sat on the porch swing, the Texas stars emerging in the sky. A cold breeze signaled nighttime's approach. Jack, she said softly, I'm truly excited to be your wife in little over a month. Her eyes met his, shimmering with hope and trepidation. Leaning against the porch rail, Jack smiled playfully. Well, Jane, I think I'll be there if you promise to show up for the wedding night. Blushing, Jane murmured her confirmation, heart racing like a captured bird. That's a date I wouldn't miss for all the cattle in Texas, he replied, stepping closer and tilting her chin up for a tender kiss. After bidding each other good night, Jane retreated to her room, thoughts swirling with questions about the wedding night. Resolved to seek advice from her sisters in the morning, she lay cocooned in blankets under the starlit sky, praying for wisdom and love to guide her into this new life with Jack. Jane stood at the church's threshold, wildflowers adorning its rustic wooden pews. Her heart thrummed with anticipation, fingers lightly grazing her delicate lace wedding gown. Ready, Jane? Imogene asked as she stood as matron of honor for Jane. More than I've ever been, Jane replied. At the altar, Jack Stewart waited, his dark hair combed neatly against a crisp white shirt. Shadows cast by late afternoon light seemed to point straight to him. He scanned the entrance intently, eager for Jane's appearance. The congregation sat in reverent silence as Jack murmured a quiet prayer for their blessed union. As the organ swelled with resonant hymns, Jane took her first step down the aisle. Wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet, a sound whispering constancy amidst new beginnings. Her eyes found Jack's, they seemed alone in that moment amidst the gathering. Each step drew her closer not just to Jack, but to the fulfillment of unspoken promises shared in quiet moments between them. Jack, unwavering as the Texas earth, watched Jane approach. His expression, once brimming with easy charm, now held the depth of his adoration. As she neared, his smile brightened. Jane's spirit and earnestness inspired a fierce tenderness in Jack. Surrounded by loved ones, his eyes conveyed an unspoken commitment. They spoke of a love resilient through scorching summers and blossoming springs, a love as enduring as the land they both cherished. The hushed church resonated with the officiant's gentle voice, as Jane clasped Jack's hand tightly. he guided them through their sacred vows. Jane Brown, he began, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to live together in holy matrimony? Will you love him, comfort him, honor and keep him in sickness and health, forsaking all others? I do, she affirmed, her conviction evident. And do you, Jack, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and keep her in sickness and health? I do, Jack responded. All along the front of the church, Jane's sisters dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Each tear symbolized their love for the youngest sister. The eldest and youngest exchanged a knowing smile that spoke of sisterhood transcending distance. As they watched Jane and Jack entwine their lives, the church seemed to embrace everyone present. In that moment, Jane and Jack's love story joined countless others within these walls. Everyone in the church seemed to be casting affectionate gazes upon Jane and Jack. Weathered pews creaked with anticipation as friends and townsfolk leaned forward, smiles broadening with each vow. A murmur of approval rustled through the congregation, embracing the couple like sunlight streaming through church windows. Then came the moment to exchange rings. Jack steadied his hand as he slid the band onto Jane's finger, a touch as tender as a petal on still water. Repeat after me, instructed Pastor Amos. Solemnly echoing him, Jack said, with this ring, I thee wed. The cool ring on Jane's skin spoke of constancy and commitment. She lifted Jack's hand and placed the golden band on his finger. With this ring, I thee wed, she repeated. Each word fell from her lips like a cherished prayer, witnessed by those gathered for their sacred union. Amidst the simple beauty of faith and love, Jane and Jack committed themselves to one another. Their hands lingered together, warmth radiating between them as they prepared to face life's unknowns. Amos Kaufman surveyed the couple before him, his eyes gleaming with joy. His warm, steady voice carried throughout the church as he concluded the ceremony. By the power vested in me, I now declare you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The congregation erupted into applause, their cheers mingling with laughter as Jack took Jane's hands in his. Jane's heart fluttered with elation as she met Jack's gaze. With tenderness, Jack leaned forward and kissed her. Their gentle yet passionate kiss seemed to defy time, momentarily erasing everything but their feelings for one another. When they parted, happiness continued to buzz through the room. Jack looked at his wife, smiling radiantly. Someone whispered in awe of the love between Jane and Jack, comparing it to the brightness of the sun. Hand in hand, they made their way down the aisle amidst a shower of rice and well wishes from friends and family. May your love flourish, called out an old gentleman. Your joy be as plentiful as the stars, echoed a woman wearing a large hat. At the heart of the festivities, Jane's eyes shimmered with laughter and her cheeks glowed. As she intertwined her fingers with Jack's strong grip, the joy of their loved ones carried them. Entering the adjoining hall, they found a garden paradise alive with blooming flowers and twinkling lights suspended above like descended stars. Jane took a deep breath and smelled Amy's stew and fresh-baked bread. Their wedding feast was something to be proud of, thanks to Amy. It's breathtaking, Jack whispered, his voice rumbling through the clamor. Paradise, Jane agreed, looking toward the gleaming dance floor, to the floral scene. Shall we? Jack playfully lifted his brows. Absolutely, replied Jane, grinning as they moved towards the center of the celebration. As the conversation subsided, guests focused on the newlyweds awaiting their first dance together. The promise of joy lingered in the air. As the tender waltz began, Jane felt Jack's hand in hers on the dance floor. Her heart fluttered, but his steady gaze anchored her. They moved together, their bodies finding a rhythm uniquely theirs. Jane, Jack whispered, this is just the start of our adventure. An adventure with you is all I could wish for, she replied, eyes glistening. They danced as if the world had narrowed down to their space. The song ended with applause. Friends and ranch hands filled the floor, David leading his wife Susan in an energetic two-step. We've started a proper hoedown, Jack grinned, guiding Jane through the crowd. Toasts were made as the night unfolded, glasses clinking in celebration of their union. The heartfelt words wove a stronger bond within the community that watched over them. May your life be as full and rich as a Texas prairie, called out Seth Clinkingbeard, raising his glass high. Voices overlapped in a chorus of well wishes. Jane's curiosity mingled with a newfound sense of belonging. She was no longer an orphan girl. She was now a bride amid a community that embraced her. In the midst of celebration, they found a quiet alcove, where only flickering candles and the Lord's presence accompanied them. "It feels surreal," Jane whispered, their hands intertwined. "Can we really be married?" "Like a dream I don't want to wake from," Jack replied softly. Jane leaned against him, cherishing their shared love. "We're blessed, Jane, in so many ways." They enjoyed a comfortable silence, reflecting on their happiness. "Do you remember when we first met?" Jack asked with a smile. "You were so curious about Texas, really about anything outside the walls of your foundling home." "You were always so sweet," Jane teased. "That's when I knew you were different." Jack laughed gently. "Different but perfectly suited for you, Mrs. Jane Stewart." She beamed at her new title. "It feels meant to be." "Then let's join our loved ones," Jack proposed, helping her up. "We have a lifetime of quiet moments ahead, but tonight, we share our joy with them." Jane slipped away from the main hall. Her steps rippled with lace and silk as she approached the sanctuary where her sisters waited for her. They had promised her advice for the wedding night. "Jane," Amy said, hugging her gently. "Your wedding night is about love, not just duty." Brenda smirked, her eyes mischievous. "Also honesty, tell Jack what you like." Cassandra adjusted her glasses. "It's natural to be nervous, but it's part of getting to know each other." Deborah blushed, fidgeting. "Hold each other close. Comfort might ease any uncertainty." Erna and Faith exchanged glances. "We baked cookies for you, a full stomach eases jitters," Erna said. Faith nodded. "And remember, patience is a virtue." Gail leaned against a pew, arms crossed. "Open the window for fresh air if you're indoors." Hannah spoke softly. "Let love be your guide, not convention." Imogene beamed at Jane. "It'll be wonderful, like a fairy tale." With their collected advice, Jane took a deep breath, feeling ready to embark on this journey with Jack, surrounded by her sister's love and wisdom. Chapter 9. Jane was sitting at the edge of the wagon seat, looking all around her as they approached Jack's family ranch. Jane's heart fluttered with anticipation, standing at the precipice of her life with Jack. "Home," he declared, pointing to the huge ranch house. Jane laughed softly. "What's so funny?" he asked, brows drawn together. "I was worried I'd be sharing a bedroll with you, and here you present me with the biggest house I've ever seen. I don't know how I'm going to keep it clean." Jane admired the sturdy beams and wraparound porch, imagining countless sunsets shared there. Inside, her few belongings from the orphanage were already mingling with Jack's. "Cozy and rustic," he remarked. "A haven for both of us," she added. "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," Jane quoted while folding a quilt. "Our treasures are simple. But our hearts are full," Jack concluded, meeting her gaze with understanding. She nodded in agreement, turning to embrace him. "I'm glad we finally get to start our lives together." He kissed the top of her head and held her close. "Shall we say a prayer of thanks?" Jane asked, intertwining her fingers with Jack's. "Yes," he agreed, heads bowed in reverence. "Remember what you said about showing up for the wedding and me showing up for the wedding night?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, of course. I'm here." A slow grin spread across Jack's face as he led her to the bedroom they would share. As the bedroom door closed behind them, Jane felt a rush of nerves and excitement. The soft glow of candlelight cast a warm ambience, making the space feel intimate and inviting. Jack's strong hands gently cupped her face as he drew her in for a tender kiss, his lips moving slowly against hers. Jane melted into his embrace, her own hands coming to rest on his broad chest. She could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm, a reminder of the life and love they now shared. As the kiss deepened, Jane poured all of her pent-up longing and affection into the connection, savoring the taste and feel of him. Jack's fingers trailed down her back, leaving tingles in their wake. With reverent touches, he began to undress her, exposing her sun-kissed skin inch by tantalizing inch. Jane trembled under his caresses, desire coiling low in her belly as she helped him out of his own clothes. They stood before each other, bare and vulnerable, drinking in the sight of one another with appreciative eyes. Jack guided Jane to the bed, laying her down gently on the soft quilt. He hovered over her, bracketing her smaller frame with his larger one. His calloused hands skimmed along her curves, leaving trails of fire in their wake. Jane arched into his touch, craving more of his affection. Their lips met again in a passionate dance, tongues tangling and breaths mingling. Jane ran her fingers through Jack's dark hair, delighting in the silky strands. He worshipped her body with kisses and caresses, paying homage to every freckle and scar. She writhed beneath him, lost in a haze of pleasure and love. When at last they joined as husband and wife, it was with a tenderness and passion that stole Jane's breath away. Jack moved above her, his strong body enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth and safety. Each thrust, each caress, was imbued with the depth of his love for her. Jane clung to him, her nails digging into the muscles of his back as waves of pleasure crashed over her. Soft moans and whispered endearments filled the air, a private symphony meant only for their ears. She lost herself in the sensation of his skin against hers, the drag of his lips across her heated flesh. They rocked together, give and take, push and pull, climbing higher and higher until ecstasy overtook them. Jane cried out Jack's name, tears of joy leaking from the corners of her eyes. Jane clung to Jack, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude as they moved together in perfect harmony. Tears of joy streamed down her face, mingling with the sweat that beaded on their skin. Each caress, each whispered word of devotion, was a sacred promise, a vow to cherish and support one another through all of life's joys and sorrows. As they climbed to the peak of pleasure, Jane felt a profound sense of connection, not just to Jack, but to something greater. It was as if their love was a tiny spark in the vast tapestry of the universe, yet no less precious or meaningful. In that moment, she understood the true power of the bond they shared, a love that could weather any storm and emerge stronger. Jack held her close as they rode out the waves of bliss, his face buried in the crook of her neck. She could feel his racing heartbeat gradually slowing, matching the steady rhythm of her own. They clung to each other, basking in the afterglow of their lovemaking, their bodies intertwined in a tangle of limbs and rumpled sheets. Jane's fingers traced lazy patterns on Jack's sweat-dampened skin, marveling at the strength and tenderness she found there. She pressed a soft kiss to his chest, directly over his heart, silently thanking God for bringing this incredible man into her life. Jack's arms tightened around her in response, his lips brushing against her temple in a gesture of pure adoration. As they lay there, spent and sated, Jane couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the lonely days at the orphanage to their wedding, every step had led her into Jack's loving embrace. She marveled at the way fate had woven their paths together, two lost souls finding solace and completeness in each other. Jack's fingers gently tilted her chin up, his dark eyes shining with unbridled affection. "I love you, Jane Stewart," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to cherish and honor you all the days of our lives." Tears of joy welled up in Jane's eyes once more, spilling onto her cheeks. "And I love you, Jack Stewart," she whispered back, her heart near to bursting with the depth of her feelings. "You are my home, my haven, and my heart." They sealed their declarations with a tender kiss, pouring all the love and devotion they felt into the sweet meeting of lips. As Jane drifted off into sleep, she knew she'd made the right decision by choosing Jack. Everything felt as if it was right. The following morning, Jane surveyed the parlor, hands on her hips. The walls were bare, lacking a personal touch. "Jack," she called, "how about hanging a painting above the mantel?" "Which one?" Jack asked, walking over to her. They had a few they'd chosen together to choose from. "The wildflowers," Jane said, smiling. "They remind me of springtime at the orphanage." Together, they unearthed the painting and hung it where the afternoon light struck the wall. They stepped back and admired its warmth and colors. "Looks like the outdoors has come inside," Jack said, wrapping an arm around her. "Shall we go see the real thing?" he suggested, gesturing toward the open front door. As they strolled across the ranch, Jane felt a connection with the land. Jack interrupted her thoughts, pointing out horses grazing in the distance. Their forms moved with elegance and grace. Beautiful, Jane whispered, gripping Jack's hand tighter. They live in the moment, Jack observed. Perhaps that's how we ought to live. As the golden hour bathed the landscape in a warm, amber light, Jane and Jack's leisurely stroll brought them to a small pond nestled at the edge of the ranch. The water mirrored the sky above, dotted with the occasional ripple as a fish disturbed its calm surface. A dragonfly skimmed across the water, and Jane watched it with a childlike fascination. "Shall we?" Jack asked, gesturing to the grassy bank. "I'd love to," Jane said, her voice airy with delight. They sat down together, Jack's arm around her shoulders. "This is the perfect spot to swim and get your feet wet in the summer months. I used to sneak down here and spend an hour just being where no one was looking." "It's just heavenly?" Jane said, closing her eyes. "Yes," Jack replied, watching her with an affectionate smile. Eventually, they retreated back to the warm embrace of the farmhouse, where the tasks of homemaking awaited their eager hands. "Look at these!" Jane exclaimed as they entered the living area. Her sisters had left vases of fresh flowers scattered about, a riot of colors against the rustic decor. Jane picked up a bouquet of wildflowers, their petals vibrant and fragrant, and buried her nose in them with a contented sigh. "Beautiful," Jack agreed, picking up another vase. Together, they meandered from room to room, deciding where each arrangement would best bring life to their new home. "Over here by the window," Jane suggested, pointing to a sunlit corner of the kitchen. "The morning light will make them glow." "Perfect," Jack affirmed, placing a vase filled with sunny daisies on the windowsill. He watched as Jane moved with purpose, her youthful eagerness tempered by a thoughtful grace. With each flower set in place, the house seemed to inhale deeply, blooming with life and color under Jane and Jack's tender care. The sweet scents mingled with the homely smell of wood and earth, weaving an invisible tapestry of comfort throughout their new abode. "Feels more like home already," Jane said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. She caught Jack's eye, and they shared a knowing look, a silent promise of the many days ahead to nurture their love and the home that cradled it. Jane's finger paused on a recipe in the open cookbook. "How about hearty beef stew for tonight, Jack?" "Let's do it," Jack agreed, rolling up his sleeves. They gathered the ingredients and began their culinary preparation. "Carrots first, I think," Jane suggested as she started peeling and chopping. "You know better than me," Jack teased while seasoning the meat. Blushing, Jane laughed. "I need you to remember that every day for the rest of our lives." As they cooked, laughter filled the kitchen. Onions brought tears to their eyes, but it was just part of their new life together. "Thyme and bay leaves," Jack said, dropping the herbs into the pot. The aroma filled the air. With the stew left to simmer, they set the table using linen napkins and Jack's mother's dishes. "Your mother would be proud," Jane whispered, placing silverware beside each plate. Jack dimmed the lights and lit candles in the center of the table. The soft glow cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Looks perfect," Jane murmured, admiring the romantic setup. "Our first supper in our new home." "Just us," Jack said, pulling out a chair for Jane. "Just us," Jane said, their joy simple yet profound as they lost themselves in their new life. Seated at the table, they breathed in the scent of the stew, a rich aroma embodying nourishment and a promising future. Jane intertwined her fingers with Jack's rough hands at the table. In the candlelight, they offered a heartfelt prayer of gratitude for their home and love. "Dear Lord," Jane prayed, "bless this house, make it a home, and weave your grace into our days." "Amen," Jack echoed, squeezing Jane's hands before releasing them. They shared a meal in comfortable silence, enjoying each mouthful of stew that represented their combined efforts. Afterward, they settled by the crackling fireplace in the parlor. As night fell, their thoughts turned to the future. Jane dreamed of children playing in the fields, while Jack envisioned them growing old together on their porch, immersed in laughter and love. Enveloped in the fire's warmth, their spirits soared. It mirrored a novel scene where love triumphs and home resides in the union of two hearts. Jane leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. "Isn't it beautiful?" Jane whispered. "More beautiful than I ever imagined," Jack replied, his arm tightening around her. They watched the fire, its warmth a reminder of their commitment to each other, a bond forged from genuine affection that had grown over time. "Today has been perfect," Jane said, inhaling the mingling scents of wood smoke and earthiness. "It has," Jack agreed, lightly kissing the crown of her head. Their eyelids grew heavy with the day's emotions and the rhythm of the flames. Hand in hand, they rose and made their way to the bedroom. The room was filled with shadows, but neither felt any need for candles or lamps. Their fingers communicated as they undressed each other. They curled into each other beneath the covers, fitting together like two halves of a whole. "Good night, my love," Jack whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Good night," Jane replied, her heart swelling with joy. In the quiet sanctuary of their room, they drifted off to sleep, beginning their journey together. Epilogue. Many years later, Mrs. Jackson approached Jane sitting on the weathered front steps of the ranch house. "Land sakes, child," Mrs. Jackson said, her eyes sparkling as she surveyed Jane. "You've grown up, and now you're a mother to your own bustling brood." Jane looked up, her eyes reflecting the vast sky above. "Mrs. Jackson," she said warmly, "I can hardly believe it myself." Mrs. Jackson chuckled softly. "My heart swells with joy every time I think about it. Even Cassandra has blessed me with a granddaughter." "Yes," Jane agreed, smiling genuinely, "the Lord has been generous with his blessings." She patted her burgeoning belly. "Number 9 for me grows impatient to be born." "You've all grown into fine women," Mrs. Jackson affirmed. "To say I'm proud of you would be a grave understatement." Her gaze wandered over the land and distant mountains. They'd carved out a good life here, under God's watchful eye and in each other's loving company. The amber glow of sunset bathed the Texas ranch as dishes piled high with food covered the long wooden table. Freshly baked bread and roasted meat's aroma blended with laughter from children weaving between adults. "Careful with the gravy, Lizzie." Amy's voice held amusement as she placed a bowl of steamed vegetables next to sliced beef. Mrs. Jackson observed from her special seat, her eyes twinkling at the chaos before her. A plate filled generously with food was handed to her, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you, my dear." During their meal, children gathered around Mrs. Jackson, sharing stories punctuated with giggles or wide-eyed expressions. A little girl with wheat-colored braids approached hesitantly. "Ma'am," she said shyly, could I call you Grandma Jackson? You feel just like a real grandma to all of us." Silence fell upon the gathering, all eyes on Mrs. Jackson. Her eyes glistened, and she embraced the young girl. "Child," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "there would be no greater honor." "Grandma Jackson," the girl repeated, and her smile brightened. The name echoed among them like a chorus of joyous acceptance. The Texas sun dipped low on the horizon, bathing the bustling scene in a warm glow as Jane and her sisters gathered around Mrs. Jackson. The matriarch's presence brought comfort amid the lively chaos of children and grandchildren filling the ranch. "Mrs. Jackson," Erna said, "we cannot express our gratitude for your blessing upon our journey here." "Indeed," Hannah added, "your visit has filled our homes with joy." Each sister stepped forward, offering thanks with earnest hearts. Mrs. Jackson received their gratitude gracefully, clasping their hands. As silence fell, she cleared her throat. "My dears, I have some news to share." Tension filled the air as children clung to their mothers. "I have decided to retire from my duties at the Foundling Home," she announced. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the group, exchanging concerned glances. "However," she added quickly, "I shall move into a modest abode on the Foundling Home's property to live out my days." "Mrs. Jackson," Jane said, stepping closer, "you've built a home within our hearts. And there, you shall forever stay." Jane and her sisters gathered around Mrs. Jackson, each offering their home to her. "I cannot bear the thought of you living alone in that small house," Amy insisted. "You must stay with my family and me instead." "I can think of nothing greater than you teaching my children as you've taught me." "Our home has a spare room perfect for you," Brenda argued. "Think of the children who love your stories," Cassandra softly pleaded. "We have an extra room for you. Consider our garden." "It would bring you joy," Erna added. "I want your influence on my children." Jane gently interjected, "Why not share the blessing?" Each of us could host you for a month at a time. Her suggestion resonated among them like a harmonious hymn. And should you yearn for Massachusetts, return whenever you wish, Jane said. But you must promise to come back to us. Rotating through their homes seemed fitting, a testament to the family they'd become under her loving guidance, not by blood but by devotion and care. The silence was broken as Mrs. Jackson lifted her handkerchief to her eyes. Worn from years of use, it now dabbed gently at the moisture in her eyes, the matriarch showing vulnerability. "Land's sakes," she murmured, disbelief painting her features with humble astonishment. "Mrs. Jackson," Jane interjected earnestly. She rose, belly first, and brushed off her skirt. "You raised us not just with shelter and provisions, but with genuine love that could warm even the coldest winter." The other women nodded, reflecting upon the countless acts of kindness they received. "Your heart has been our sanctuary, and your wisdom, our guiding star," Jane continued, gratitude in her gaze. "We stand here today because of you, strong, loving women who learned from the best, will remain faithful to the woman who cherished us as her very own." The air seemed to hum with the truth of Jane's words, and their bond with Mrs. Jackson felt unbreakable and eternal. Jane sat on the porch, taking in the laughter and conversation from her family. Jack joined her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders as they watched their boisterous children. "Quite the gathering we have today," Jack remarked, warmth in his voice. Jane smiled. "It seems like only yesterday I was boarding that train." Jack chuckled. "And now look at us, a family larger than either of us could have imagined." As their fingers intertwined, Jane looked into his eyes, reflecting her conviction. "I'm so happy I found you," she said simply. A tender squeeze of her hand served as his silent promise. "I believe it was I who found you," he whispered, a smile tugging up the corners of his lips.